I'm Sean Kidley. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Thank you for joining me at this event today, our Climate Bonds Connect 2022 conference. The theme of this conference is getting to $5 trillion a year by 2025. Why? Because we've got a bit of a challenge. We have a world in crisis. In crisis in the sense we're starting to feel the impacts of climate change, as you've seen over the last year, in a way that were not expecting before 2050. Things are moving fast. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, not as a stretch goal, but as a minimum requirement to have a 50% chance of a reasonable future for our children. These are not good odds, by the way. You know, if the trading desk was saying, well, if you do this by this, you'll get a 50% chance of getting good results on your trading desk, that's not a good story to be told. But nevertheless, that's what we've been told. So it's a minimum requirement. That requires capital. As we saw at the MAFS conference a couple of days ago, McKinsey's has shown we need $9.2 trillion a year shifted in mitigation. And that's before we get to resilience. You'll hear more about resilience a little later today. So this challenge, we've had some success, and the green bonds market, and it's the daughters of green bonds, the social, the resilience, the sustainability bonds that are all arisen from that theme, have proven that capital will move if we construct investments that meet their risk yield requirements and also address their long-term assets and liabilities managing problems. Because, of course, we're going to see wholesale portfolio decimation for GIC and Temasek and all the likes if we don't address climate change. We don't want to be investing in a world of the kind of volatility that's been predicted. This is a nasty place. So we've got to fix this problem. The green bond market is over $1 trillion. In fact, we're going to get ready to run rate of $1 trillion a year in the first half of next year. But we need to be having a run rate of $5 trillion a year to be having a real contribution. A big chunk of that's going to come from Asia. China is already the second largest and likely to be the largest green bond market in the world next year for a variety of reasons, including the government deciding to take drastic action. The 30-60 targets in China are real, and they're going to be met way ahead of time. And we'll hear Xi Jinping talking about that later this year at the Communist Party Congress. But of course, that's just one nation. We need all nations to be doing their bits. But as I said, doing their bits on addressing climate doesn't just mean cutting down your emissions. It also means improving your resilience. Singapore and the countries of ASEAN are highly exposed. We need to prepare, folks. We need to prepare for the increased severity of typhoons in the Philippines. Now, one of our staff here, a social media person, Mikey, tells me that he got enthused about working on climate change because he lived in a town that was demolished by a typhoon in Luzon years ago. That story is going to become much more common unless we can prepare. It is possible to prepare. The science is there. It does mean increasing the height of wharves in Singapore to ensure we can manage silver. Actually, that's being done. Singapore is ahead of the game. But it also means managing our water in a different kind of way. It means increasing the stormwater drains in Manila and Bangkok and Singapore, for example, simple things like that. It means preparing our societies. A just transition, a term you've probably heard about, doesn't just mean jobs for people who used to be coal workers. It also means jobs for people that are going to be negatively impacted by the climate change we have, which is going to be severe. How do we construct an economy and a society that stays wealthy in the context of the kind of shocks we're going to get every couple of years so we can rebuild, or we can get up the next morning and start and get back to work and start building, continue to build the future for our children that we want to build. These are the challenges we face. $5 trillion a year in 2025 is a necessary goal. The purpose of today, from my perspective, is to explore this issue and give you a sense of how we're going to get there and give you a sense of something else, which is the opportunity involved in doing this. Because this is going to mean a lot of investment. This is going to mean capital moving. Capital markets will both make this happen and benefit from this. Opportunity is how we energize. We're not going to energize by saying it's going to be a disaster. We need to know the severity of the problem to understand what we've got to do, because we've got to make sure we don't mess up and do the things that aren't necessary, sure, but we also need to understand the opportunity. If McKinsey's right, and we invest $9.2 trillion a year just in the mitigation side, that is the biggest investment boom in history. Just think about that. Well, think about it during the course of the day. I would like to introduce, to kick off today's session, a video by Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citibank, who's our primary sponsor for this event. I'm hoping the team can invite Jane onto the screen. Yes?
Thank you, Sean, and on behalf of Citi, I'm delighted to join you in welcoming everyone to Climate Bonds Initiative Connect 2022. And this year's event comes at a defining moment, a year of intense weather, including summer heat waves and wildfires across the globe, has once again highlighted the urgency of the climate crisis. Yet, the war in Ukraine and its impacts on the global energy supply have further complicated the transition to a low-carbon economy. At Citi, our determination is as strong as ever. We believe that global financial institutions like ours have the opportunity and indeed the responsibility to play a leading role in confronting climate change. We have engaged in these efforts for many years, putting in place the foundations to help our clients achieve net zero. And today, there's an additional S in ESG, and that's security. And our efforts are helping corporates and communities build resiliency and sustainability in combating climate change. Earlier this year, we released our initial plan for achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Given the size and the breadth of Citi's portfolios and businesses, reaching net zero, it's a Herculean undertaking. What does it mean? It means rolling up our sleeves and working with our clients to embed the transition into every aspect of our work. The transition won't look the same for all of our clients, and that's why we're engaging client by client and sector by sector. Where the solutions are known, renewable energy, for example, we must facilitate scale and widespread adoption. And where solutions are less clear and more difficult to define, such as in agriculture or heavy industry and other high-emitting sectors, we must discover climate-friendly alternatives to business as usual, all with the goal of reaching cost parity as quickly as possible. The financial sector can help unleash the capital and put companies on the path to net zero, but strong government policy and technological advance are critical to driving change at scale. Thankfully, we have great partners such as Climate Bonds, which has been such a champion for public-private sector collaboration and which has consistently delivered cutting-edge solutions and provided clear, ambitious, science-based standards to support the transition. Confronting one of the biggest challenges of our time, it's not going to be easy, but out of collaboration and cooperation come hope and progress. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Jane. We have nearly 1,000 people online. This is a hybrid conference around the region, so we're a tiny minority of everyone online. You should have been given an invitation to the app. Please do use the app, because that's the way we're talking to each other across the community of people who are participating in this conference today. This is the first of 4 global conferences. It goes Singapore, London, Mexico City, New York, which means, by the way, you're free to join the other ones should you wish to participate in that time zone when the time comes. Look at our website for more details. Now I'd like to invite a very good friend, a pioneer in green finance, Harry Cho, to the stage to join me. I'm hoping this works. Yes, we're doing well. We're very privileged to be in this great hall from the Singapore Stock Exchange and to be able to introduce the Singapore Stock Exchange as a Climate Bonds partner. We hope to be working together on lots of things. We've already worked together on a couple of things. Harry can give some details. But I guess what I want to do today is have a conversation with Harry about what the challenges are, what you see as the things we need to do are, and so on. You've already heard me talk about the challenge we face, right? I won't go over more about that. You know that we've had some success in sustainable finance, and I got told earlier that of your fixed income listings on the stock exchange here, is it close to 20% now are green or sustainable in the fixed income, which is pretty cool. Tell me more about what's happening here.
Well, Sean, I wanted to ask you these questions first for you to set the global stage for us before we kick off the conference. So before we do, firstly, thank you and welcome everyone to Singapore Exchange Group and to the online audience as well. Very, very welcome. We're honored to be partnering with Climate Bonds Initiative, of course, and our good friend Sean Kidney, who truly is a pioneer with his team. And so welcome to Singapore, Sean. I think there are three key components that we can both discuss to kickstart off. What is the urgency that we're looking at? And with that urgency, what is the ambition that we're hoping to set? And thirdly, what can we collectively be hopeful about? Because we need that hope. You know, this is going to be a marathon. We're all here today because we're pioneers, we're leaders, and collectively we must work together on that. So Sean, on the urgency front, I'll give just a few pointers and I would love to hear you talk more. Well, 124 countries actually have committed to net zero, of which about 104 have pledged or committed to 2050 or sooner. Now, you can argue, of course, science-based perspective, we need to do more. But the progress is happening, and it is quite urgent. Now, here in Asia, we're lucky that Korea and Japan, for example, have set the scene already with 2050 net zero targets. Here in ASEAN, we've seen tremendous progress in the last year or two in terms of the pledges and ambition level going up. 8 out of 10 ASEAN countries have now set some level of net zero ambition that's more geared towards 2050. That is quite amazing for a region that has the significant percentage of the energy here to be coal-fired power plant, for example. Now, let's not underestimate the scale of change that we need to be undergoing. Same for China, same for India, same for major economies here in Asia. We've got Monetary Authority of Singapore's Ms. Gillian Tan here today, and she'll be sharing more. But with the Singapore government stepping up in their ambitions, they've currently, of course, they've already set a mid-century net zero goal, and there's an open consultation out right now for a net zero 2050 goal. And supplementing that also are some of the carbon tax pricing. It's going to be stepping up over time to $25 in 2024, 2025, to up to 80 and plus, and way beyond that by 2030. So all of these progress is happening, but the urgency comes in because if you look at the latest information, for example, from Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS, it shows that we're actually crystallizing what's called a disorderly transition, or possibly a hothouse world. Now, what is a disorderly transition? That means that, yes, there are climate change, there are policies that are being put in place. However, it's not coordinated to the extent that we need to see it, and or it's not happening fast enough, and it's possibly going to come more towards 2030, just before that, or after 2030. So what that means is we're going to see significant transition risk, and that's why it's going to be disorderly. But if you're, on the other hand, if you look at the current NDCs, we're actually crystallizing a hothouse world, i.e. the physical risk is going to be very, very significant, although the transition risk might be a bit less. So that is the urgent side, that we must collectively step up, not only the countries, but the private sector, and there's a lot of funding needing to be done.
I mean, it's difficult when you're in an economy that has invested a lot in things that we now discover after all these years create a harm to the environment. This is a challenge, and then turning the ship around is very tough. It's also difficult when, historically, we've got a climate justice framework. Emissions have come from the US and Europe, and more recently China. China now is twice the level of emissions production per annum as the US, let alone Japan. So this is all difficult, but unfortunately, no matter what the fairness of it, the numbers are what they are. We have to get emissions down very quickly around the world. So we're forced to act. And I have this regular conversation about, but hang on. The US has got to fix this act first. And let's say, while the Climate Act has just gone through in the US with some incredible subsidies for green technologies in there, the truth is for the last 5 years, they haven't been doing anything. And they've still got a lot of high emissions. So there are some fair criticisms, but we're the ones in this region that are going to suffer. And it's not going to help us to stamp our foot and say we're not doing anything until the US does it, and then we'll just cope with the typhoons, the civil rises, and so on. We kind of are forced to act anyway. But it's also true that we have to prepare on that last part, because now that we know that the world has been messed up, which we didn't realize as much, I mean, scientists did, but let's say the general body politic, until relatively recently, we've got to prepare. The resilience agenda is very important. We'll hear more from Lawrence Sorkin in the last session talking about resilience, the importance part of it. But differentiated targets are problematic. So it's not true that we can keep building coal-fired power stations in Indonesia and say it's okay because the US was polluting 100 years ago. It's fair, but it's not correct in the terms of the science. And this is what we're in the middle of grappling with in the region. It is really tough to do this. But let's be clear, it's tough everywhere. The nature of what we've done globally, the emissions we've put in the atmosphere, and remember, we've put in more emissions of the atmosphere in the last 30 years than in the previous 150 years. So it's all continued to be getting worse while we've been having UN climate change conferences, unfortunately, means according to the IPCC, we now have to do a drastic reduction globally in emissions, as I said earlier, to have even a reasonable chance of having a reasonable life for our kids. And the consequences of not doing it are dire. So we're now in the middle of this big discussion, and I'm going to say the discussion in Asia is very focused on how do we transition. And that's the right discussion, right? How do we move our economy, our society from where it is now to where it needs to be, both in terms of addressing resilience and in contributing necessarily to the change. I always take the IEA net zero pathway as a good benchmark. When you put in all the sums of emissions reduction we have to get, it's just not possible to count any new fossil fuel investments as things that you can do as gets to the Paris Agreement. But they have factored in, absolutely correct, differentiated rollouts. So the Europe and the US have to close down their coal and gas-fired power stations earlier. That's like by 2035. And Asia and other countries have longer to go, but not enough time to build new ones. So all those new ones, the new coal-fired power stations in Indonesia, they're a problem. They're a problem for us. We've got to work on that, etc. So this is a taste of the extent to which we're in the throes of working out the nature of the ambition. We're trying to crystallize an understanding to make it easy for everyone. And this morning we ran a workshop here for potential public sector green bond issuers in Singapore, where we described the rule sets. It's not a matter of doing complicated carbon. It's a matter of looking at the MAS taxonomy, which is a guidance, a clarity, a simplicity of guidance about what qualifies in the context of these discussions, these complications. Now, we can't sort it all out at once. There's work that we're still doing. It's going to take time. We put out rule sets as quickly as possible to provide guidance, and that's happening in Europe and in China and Latin America as well, those kind of rule sets. So that's how we're trying to make it simple, and I'm hoping this is going to make it really simple for the people listing on your exchange as well.
Yeah, so why don't we combine the ambition and the hope together in rounding off our discussion, maybe, Sean? So ambition for this region, it's when you sit down and really try to think about the level of ambition that's needed is extraordinary. We're just getting our head around how to even move about on climate change mitigation alone. Yesterday and tonight as well, there's a two full day task force member annual get together. Unfortunately, I'm virtually contributing in London for Task Force for Nature Related Financial Disclosure Task Force members. And there we're discussing how much nature and biodiversity, is it really separate from climate change mitigation? We had Mr. Emmanuel Faber come, and actually the chair for ISSB come and do a closed door, a 30-minute closed door Chatham House rules sharing on the progress of where things are going with ISSB. And one direction is clear. When we think about climate, it really cannot be looked alone, and that's ever much so the case here in particular. Not only the nexus with nature and biodiversity, but also on the social side. So thinking through that, and what can Asia do to finance this in a way that is coherent, but also be setting managed pathways. And this is what something Ms. Yuki Asui, who's heading the GFAN's Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero for the APAC Hub here in Singapore for the region. That's one of the key things that she'll be talking about in the next. But we have to look at how do we support better and more of the green ambition that we already have and that we're already working on, combined with a managed phase out of certain assets, but also transition overall, whilst, and the picture will only get more complex, and this is where we need to simplify but not lose the details, whilst protecting and creating impact on the other environmental and social objectives as well. Now, just very quickly on the solutions and the hope part. I mean, the conference, I'm sure many of you probably were there on Tuesday at MAS's conference for Transition Zero and Blended Finance. One thing that's absolutely clear to us, I mean, this is a leading bond venue already, as you had briefly mentioned, Sean, just in the last 12 months. I mean, this is #1 venue, especially when it comes to international issuances by APAC issuers in G3 currencies. We've had more than $51 billion of more than 110 individual bond issuances in the last 12 months here, totaling about 110 billion or 225 issuances that's currently listed. But, what can we do to grow more of that? How can we support more projects and more companies actually tap into the capital? Two examples. I can see that we have Bayfront COO Nicholas in the room as well, Mr. Nicholas Tan. It was also mentioned on Tuesday, but we must allow the institutional capital to tap in more, and that securitization of projects. We need to support the projects, and the securitization, that concept needs to proliferate more. #2, there were great discussions on blended finance and how to reduce risk capital for more companies of different sizes to come here. Now, of course, we've got the MAS grant scheme that we work together with MAS already to support up to 100,000 Sing dollars for upfront costs of issuance. But I also want to just highlight another partnership that we have with UK government's FCDO, which is the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office Mobilis program. So we've also got Thomas Fenn on here. Maybe you can just wave here to support. If there are any bond issuers who have any of your business the issuances or your company itself as well, that's contributing to SDGs, and it is defined quite broadly, and you're going to be a bond issuer, there is technical assistance to, again, help defray some of your costs, right? So speak to Thomas as well. We need more of these programs. There's anchor investment that the program also gives for ECM, so the IPO candidates, etc. too. So we need to be growing more of this type of ecosystem to support.
Isn't the Singapore Stock Exchange lucky to have her? She's very good. To wrap up, there are three things we need to do. One is clarity. We do need to make it easy for people to understand what to do, because it's actually really complicated in parts. So guidance, look to the taxonomy, the MAS work in particular. That's one. Two is we then need to tilt our whole financial system towards green, towards sustainable, towards resilient. Now that includes blended finance, which is the key subject of the MAS conference 2 days ago. It includes regulatory measures to ensure that we invest in the right kind of water infrastructure and stop doing the bad infrastructure in Thailand and Vietnam and in Indonesia. There's a whole bunch of things. Tilt to green is the theme. But we also need to start imagining and creating the world that we need to have. That does mean clean, green cities. It does mean walking instead of getting in a car wherever you can. It does mean very energy efficient buildings and very energy efficiency air conditioning, which is not the case in Manila or Jakarta at this stage. It does mean agriculture that's resilient and can survive the changes that are starting to happen. There's so much. This is, if you like, a privilege of a moment to be in. It's an existential crisis for the human species. It's a bit uncertain how we're going to come out of this, but it's also a moment where we have to, we're forced to think about what kind of world we really want our kids to live in and make it happen. We have to make it happen, because if we don't make it happen, what I can tell you is it's going to be ugly. If we do make it happen, we can make it really cool, survive this crisis, and create wealth, because that's what happens when you invest $9.2 trillion a year in the right kind of fashion. The opportunity is unbelievable. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Huri, for all your work. And I'd like to now invite our next panel. Van Yuki first onto the stage. Yuki Yusui, who's the Managing Director of the Glasgow Finance. I always lose track.
Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero.
Do you know, I've been saying GFANS ever since Glasgow, and I still don't get it right every time. Just too many letters in it, but it's a very cool initiative of $130 trillion of assets under management backing it. So this is the elephant on the globe. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you to introduce your panel.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for those online as well. Very nice to see you. I'd like to ask the panelists to join me on stage. So, Ms. Gillian Tan, Assisting Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Ms. Ritu Aurora, CEO, CIO, and Asia Alliance Investment Management, Singapore. And online, Mr. Calvin Kwek, Senior Environmental Specialist, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And lastly, but not least, Ms. Nikki Kempt, Director, Asia Pacific Nature and Climate Finance, World Economic Forum. It's not in. Is there an order?
We just have some fun. But okay.
Okay. Wow. So we have a female lineup today. Calvin is our online. Would you be able to show him as well? Yep. Okay. So yeah, thanks very much for Sean and Harry for setting this up. It's really, I think, they've kind of cut our work. They've introduced everything and the challenges and even got to the solutions, which is great. So this session is about going beyond green. Is Asia ready for the transition? So Sean was talking about this $9.2 trillion a year by 2050, annual investment by 2050 that that has to happen, and that this is actually a great opportunity. So we do want to focus on the opportunity side and whether Asia is ready for that. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of stakeholders who are in their own way responsible for making this happen. And today's panel is a small kind of snippet of that stakeholder, a small ecosystem that we've created together. So maybe as an introductory remark, if you could just tell how you sit within that, big ambition of financing the transition. What is your role in that ecosystem? So starting from Gillian, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Yuki, and huge thanks to Sean and CBI and all the sponsors for having me here. Can I just check, how many of you were at the MES Blended Finance Conference this week? Oh, thank you. That really warms my heart. That's super. Okay, great. So anyway, as you've heard, my name is Gillian. I'm the Assistant Managing Director of Development and International at MES. And, my main role is really to develop Singapore's financial center, which means many of you will corner me at tea break and ask about many other asset classes and things. But clearly, sustainable finance plays an important role there. As I was thinking about what role the MES and other regulators should play, it struck me that it's kind of sad that we even need a central authority to come in. In an ideal world, all the incentives and, I guess kind of interests would be aligned such that, everyone would just organically move towards net zero, right? And Sean explained to us how urgent it is, how existential it is. So you shouldn't need the MES or anyone else to tell you what to do. But unfortunately, I think climate change is not one of those issues where everything is beautifully aligned. The reality is that we are a deeply fossil-fueled civilization, right? And decades, indeed centuries of growth has been premised on the use of fossil fuels, on the use of coal. And now we find ourselves in this problem. And really what we need to disrupt that growth story while continuing to prosper and do well is a great deal of economic restructuring that's pretty fundamental. We're going to need technological advancements, and we're going to need a heck of a lot of financing, right? And I think that because you have these three very difficult pieces, combined with a really tight time frame, right? We need to actually get things done by 2030 and then 2050. There are going to be limitations to a market-driven effort. So even though, Yuki, GFANZ, and so many others have done great work, CBI as well, the reality is we cannot just leave it to the market. And I think that's where regulators have to step in. So I do feel that regulators and central banks can play a role in galvanizing the whole system to work better together as a system. A few specifics. First, I think we play a role in defining the specific challenges that we all need to be alive to. I'll give you an example. I think when we first started, in Singapore at least, gaining attention to this issue, we were very focused on green, right? So we had a green finance action plan. Harry talked about some of our grant schemes. They were very green focused for a while. But what we've realized is that green is actually not the issue. Green sectors make up less than, I think, 8% of our economy. So what's really needed is a focus on transition. It's much more difficult, but we do need to refocus attention there. The other area which I think central banks and regulators like the MES can contribute to is drawing attention to other key themes. which actually Sean helped me out already this afternoon. So, I think there's a lot of focus in the market on mitigation and financing mitigation, but how about adaptation? How about resilience, right? Especially for Singapore and this region where that's critical. So, calling attention to that. And finally, the other area is blended finance. Did you guys catch how many times the term blended finance was used in that short half an hour earlier? Thanks very much, Harry and Sean. It was quite a fair bit, right? And that really was the MAS saying, this is a critical structuring mechanism. We need to do more. How do we call attention to what could be a very technical term, a financing term? Let's call a conference and, let's get 600 people in the room together. And that's raised awareness in a way that is critical. So that's one. I think the other thing that regulators can do is really ensuring a strong pipeline of bankable projects. So, what we hear from folks in the audience and folks like you all the time is that there's no shortage of finance. What you lack is strong, de-risked bankable projects, right? And I do feel that central banks and regulators can step forward, as we have done, working with other government players, of course, to enhance project bankability, right? Whether it's through project preparation, feasibility studies, and so on. The final area where I think policy and regulation and regulators can play a role is as your supervisors. Now this is going to get attention, right? Because everyone worries about this part of our role. And I think, as supervisors, we can be very clear, first and foremost, that if you've got transition or brown sectors or assets on your books, it's not about just an immediate exit, right? Tempting as that might be, but rather that the financial sector, all of you in this room, have a role to play in ensuring an orderly transition, right? Working with your clients to point them towards sectoral pathways that are aligned to 1.5 degrees and getting them the financing and the know-how they need to get there. So that's really critical as well. And finally, just one area which didn't come up this whole week in all the discussions that we've been having, and that's talent. So I think financial sector regulators and central banks like myself, right, we can do more to ensure that our players here have the sustainable finance or sustainability talent they need to grow in this area. I'm part of a group that is working on a jobs transformation map for sustainable finance. And what we're actually doing is studying in a very quantitative way the impact of sustainable finance trends on jobs and, in terms of new roles and also the skills that will be required. And we're looking at that at a 3, 5, and 10-year horizon. We hope to have the results of this sometime next year and to share that with everyone. We also had DPM Wong recently announce a $400 million program, the Talent and Leaders in Finance program. And part of that $400 million grant money will go towards funding grants to develop specialist talent in Singapore. And one key area of specialist talent required is sustainable finance. So hang in there, help is on the way. We'll make sure that you have the talent, the attention, and the supervisory support you require to get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. I think the first point you raised a lot of points, so I won't be able to summarize everything, but just 2 points to pick. So I think the role of central banks, getting the market to focus on the challenges. I think that was a crucial role that TCFD, which led to the development of the TCFD that my boss Mark Carney at the time was the governor of the Bank of England, raised that climate change is a risk to the financial system globally. And I think those kind of roles is something very unique that the central banks play. And on talent, I think that's something that Singapore really has an edge on this. I think all the ministries, not just MAS, but all the ministries are excellent at doing that. So I think that's a good role model that other financial regulators should think about, because I don't think that's the first thing that they would think about normally. Yeah. then we have Calvin online, so welcome. Yeah, nice to see you, and thanks very much for joining. Maybe just so that you're not there alone, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about how your role AIIB plays in the financing of net zero transition?
Thank you, Yuki, and thank you, Sean and the team for inviting me. So it's a pleasure to see you all to take part in this conference. I'm an environmental specialist at the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is, as many of you may well know, an institution that was founded 5 or 6 years ago, very soon after the Paris Accord, which is probably the most significant global treaty that the world has to address the climate crisis. I've been here for the last 4 years, and prior to this, I had spent some time in NGOs and also spent some time working in the financial sector. And just to start off with a bit of a hat tilt or nod towards Gillian and Singapore. I am from Singapore, but I've lived in Beijing for a long time now. But when I left Singapore 12 years ago, there was really not that much going on in sustainable finance and green finance. And it's amazing to see the great progress that Singapore and MAS and the authorities there have done to push this to the forefront of the agenda. At the AIIB, an institution that's focused on funding infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure is actually key towards ensuring sustainable economic and development goals for our members. We have a target of ensuring our portfolio, 50% of it is allocated towards climate adaptation or climate finance, mitigation and adaptation by 2025, and we will be Paris aligned next year, according to an overall joint methodology that is being coordinated with our other MDB partners. I think one of the challenges, I think, with respect to green finance is that I often reflect about, and Sean talked about the great numbers that will be needed to address the climate crisis, is the ongoing sense that we are behind the curve. One of the things that I keep in mind is that the Earth has actually warmed 1 degree on average since the late 19th century. And that sounds like a very small number. But the threat of a 10-year storm is 3 times higher compared to levels at which global warming was not there. And the threat for a 50-year storm is 5 times higher. So the news that we see regarding frequent events and so forth, those things are par for the course now. And so the challenge is not just obviously moving towards a net zero future, but also ensuring resilience as well. And adaptation, as we have, as I'm sure we have discussed and will be discussing, is difficult to finance because it requires a very specific context approach towards identifying the source or the particular areas in which we want to try and protect from the devastating effects of climate change. Anyways, I can go on and on. I just wanted to just share a few initial thoughts regarding the challenge for climate finance and the like, and the fact that we need to do more on adaptation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think when we talk about net zero transition, there's a lot of focus on the mitigation side, but as Sean was saying earlier, and as you were saying, I think the adaptation and how the mitigation agenda crosses over to nature and other blue economy and other sustainability issues is going to be more important. And in the end, everything will come in a grand circle, that it has to be sustainable development. Yeah, thank you. Then let me go over to Ritu. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe thanks for the opportunity, and maybe I just take a moment to introduce Allianz. Allianz is a founding member of United Nations Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, and we were very actively participating even earlier this week. Our commitment goes very deep, not just on the business side, but also on the investment side to net zero. And we've been taking commitments and delivering on it, and we have a pathway ahead, which each one of us understands.
Would you like to talk a little bit about how you think investment managers play a role in the financing and the mobilization of financing of net zero?
Sure. I think investment managers or asset owners, as we like to call ourselves, play a very significant role, more so when it comes to insurance companies like ourselves or pension funds, because we have a very long dated horizon. We invest for long periods of time, and hence from an asset liability matching point of view, the transition is something we can very comfortably finance, while some other investors who have 3 to 5 year horizon would struggle to. So hence there's a very natural fit. Also, we carry fiduciary responsibility, and many a times our policyholders are also quite keen that we have investments which make the world a better place. And now more and more what we see is a pull from the market and from the customers towards making investments that support this kind of transition to green energy. The other aspect why it fits in very well is very deep pockets. Insurance money is fairly sticky. Over time, it builds a big estate, and hence we do have the balance sheet size and scale to support these kind of initiatives. Having said that, we do face a few challenges, and I've been in various conferences discussing them. The challenges that we face, and we face that as a group of investors, even at UN Net Zero, we are a large group of investors, and we believe coming together gives us the force and scale to make a change. One challenge, and where maybe I can request help from Gillian also, and I know efforts are already underway in Asia, is taxonomy. Different jurisdictions are developing different taxonomies, not completely aligned at different points of time. And you can see even from a simple example like Allianz, it can get very complex, because I'm an insurance company from Germany, keen to invest in Asia, but if the taxonomies are not aligned, it becomes a big roadblock to investment. And this is still a developing space. We are contributing, we are participating, but I think as regulators and governments, that's a big space that will help channelize more institutional money. The second aspect would be benchmarks. We need more and more benchmarks which demonstrate the climate and the transition aspect, because as investment people, we need our performance to be benchmarked. At this point of time, we struggle to find the appropriate benchmarks to reflect that. And that is another space which is under development. I think talent, which you talked about, is so important, I think, and that goes across the spectrum. And lastly, I think is disclosures, wherein at this point in time, and when I say disclosures, it's not just the corporates or the companies that are raising finance, it's also the disclosures and transparency on data that we would request from MDBs with whom we are trying to partner on blended finance. So the speed and transparency of disclosures will really add momentum to what institutional investors are keen to do. It's aligned to do. And like you said, it is a pull, right? It should not be a regulator or government pushing. These are few things that we're trying to overcome, which I agree with you. There's immense capital waiting there to find its way to these kind of investments. And these are some of the roadblocks we need to clear as we progress on this journey.
Thank you, Ritu. That was very nice. Just a question. So when you say taxonomy, does Allianz in Singapore follow the EU taxonomy? And does it also
It depends
use
on
some
which
of
balance sheet. So Allianz invests out of 70 countries. We have presence in 70 countries. So it will depend. If I'm investing out of my German balance sheet, then definitely, because it's governed by German laws, I have to follow German taxonomy. But if I was doing it out of, say, my Singapore or Malaysian balance sheet, then I would follow. So as a global company, we have to balance both ends.
I see. Is there a global strategy around that, or there are more kind of independence in the different alliances?
See, taxonomy is a government space, so EU is far progressed, and EU has come together to develop how they will interpret green. They've gone very detailed in how they will treat each part of the sectors and investments. Asia is developing. There's an ASEAN body which has come together. It has participations from all the governments, large governments and regulators. It's under development. But it is another thing to expect that all the countries in Asia will adopt the same methodology. If we don't, we have a big problem on hand. We realize that, but then it's also simpler said than done.
Yeah.
Because if Malaysia treats the same investment differently from Singapore and then differently from Thailand, you can imagine the complexity it will create for investors like us.
Yeah.
Maybe I can come in here. Yeah, no, just to keep it lively and interesting. Sorry, Nikki. Just come in. No, I mean, Ritu makes excellent points, right? And I think what Ritu just summarized is what many global financial institutions are facing every day, right? So they're having to grapple with the EU taxonomy. They're keeping up to date, hopefully, with the green finance industry taxonomy, which Sean, by the way, is industry-led, not MAS. But thank you for the shout out. Yeah, and we're mindful of that. So I think we can try to manage it in a few ways. The first is that insofar as the GFIT, the industry-led taxonomy, is concerned, it's really important that it can be mapped and is interoperable with the EU taxonomy. So that's the first point. And I think it will be. We've been very careful, working together with industry to ensure that they use a methodology, the metrics and thresholds and so on, that will allow that interoperability. Now, ASEAN, Ritu's absolutely right to point that out, because that's a little bit more complex, right? Because now you've got another regional bloc, Singapore, ASEAN, and the EU, and how's that going to work? The reality is ASEAN, as I think Ritu acknowledged, is a far more complex place, right? We've got many countries at different stages of development. Even putting aside stages of development, the stages of data readiness and collection vary greatly as well. But even then, I think a real effort has been made to ensure that the top tier, the most advanced tier of the ASEAN taxonomy, which is called the Plus standards, that is 1.5 degree aligned, which is in keeping with international standards, and that it will be fully interoperable with both the GFIT taxonomy as well as the EU taxonomy. So I think these are things that policymakers, governments are well aware of, and the devil will be in the details, but at least the intention is clear, and I think we're heading in the right path.
Thanks very much for that extra information. Yeah. So now let me turn to the real economy sector representative in this panel. Ms. Nikki, would you like to explain about your work and about how the real economy plays the role, how WEF looks at what you play as a voluntary initiative in your space with your members? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Sean, thanks very much for having me here. The forum does try to be very real, so I hope the real economy is is what we're delivering on. I'm based here in Singapore for the World Economic Forum, and my work here has been very much regionally focused and working in the areas of what can we do specifically targeted around sustainable finance and investment for climate and now more recently also nature. And that actually spans quite a few segments because we don't see these topics or pillars, if you like, as separate, and we see it as a system. And so within those sort of topics, there are systems that relate to food, water, oceans, circular economy, what's happening with biodiversity in the region, and so on. So it's targeted but not linear. So one of the things that I wanted to really raise here was that I think, and this is something I think Sean has touched on as well, is we have a lot of technology, and this region's fantastic for this, right? There's amazing innovations that are coming out of this region, and Singapore's hosting a lot of that through a lot of its initiatives here. And we see that through a number of the decarbonisation initiatives and across the energy sector, but also across industry. We've also got an understanding of what we're facing, and the science is telling us a very clear story. So we've got that. There's also a lot of capital in the system. What we need is the pathways and the mechanisms to get that together, the cooperation to get that together. And this is where we try to work in the real economy to bring that together. So the forum's really an enabler to cooperation and aligning of interests and defining those pathways and mechanisms. One of them, I want to, it's a lovely segue actually into what Rita was saying, because we're working closely with, at the moment, one of the initiatives that we're doing here is working closely with the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and a third partner, which is the EU ASEAN Business Council, on an initiative that looks specifically at the financing mechanisms for emerging markets on transition investment. So acknowledging that green is now, and thanks to Sean and many other people that sort of run behind him's push on green bonds, is now $1 trillion investment initiative in the world. So we know what green bonds are, we know what green investment is, and unfortunately what's happening is, because of the push to net zero, the race to net zero, we are running very fast at green. But particularly in emerging markets, which are deeply embedded in the supply chains globally, we need to look at what investment is needed for transition. And that's not easy, it's not clear. Financial systems don't operate well where there's uncertainty of cash flow and uncertainty of future. So how do we define something that is really has a lot more clarity? And we agree standards about what transition looks like, so that we try and avoid transition washing. And so this particular project that we've been working with your colleagues on, fantastic input, has recently produced a paper which I would recommend to you. We've called it bit provocative, but we've called it Code Red, because we do think we're in a phase of Code Red, and it's a call to action on emerging markets transition investment. And what it does is it breaks down from a series of expert dialogues, recommendations that say, what will it take to create a high-functioning, liquid, effective transition investment market. Now, it's high level, it's first cut, but it's really quite targeted. There's 4 themes, and I'm going to run through them very quickly, if I may. Have I got time, Yuki? Yeah, okay. So the first is to expand institutional investor awareness of the opportunity and the urgency of the need. What does that mean? We touched on taxonomy. That's a big part of it. How can taxonomies play a role in facilitating and creating clarity? But that's not all. One of the interesting parts of all of this is financial metrics and how we measure success in decarbonising. And Rita will understand what I'm about to say, and I hope many of you do as well. But the weighted average carbon intensity scores is a great example of where our financial metrics skew behaviour towards something that perhaps we didn't want. And this is where the carbon intensity of a whole of company is captured if there is, for example, a green bond issued by that company, but it's carbon intensive, it's high carbon intensive overall. So in other words, you just don't get that benefit of investing in a green or a transition or a, where the company is trying to use those proceeds in order to become more green. So these sorts of things really need attention, and we need to make sure that we're not having these adverse consequences of these metrics. The third point around this theme is a contentious one. It's been put to a number of regulators, and that is differentiated capital treatment. Now, the focus here is the financial impact of climate. We're not saying that all climate investment should be necessarily differentiated from capital, but where there's financial impact and risk impact, then it's no different to to credit risk or operational risk as is currently counted in capital metrics. So how can we build something that really hones in on that and provides an incentive? The second theme, increased supply of green transition investment. What do we mean? Supply is those who are issuing. Why aren't they issuing? Why isn't there enough issuance in this region? Well, if to start with we said every public company and every listed entity had to report Scope 1 and 2 emissions, all of a sudden we would have transparency and an impetus for issuance. And that would be a big positive for motivation, if you like, for supply. The other is subsidies and incentives, and it's fantastic what the MAS has done around this, really trying to reduce or draw down the friction costs in issuance. So if we could see more of that, I think that would be helpful. The third theme is centred around something that we've also touched on, which is blended finance, but it's specifically around the role of one of the key actors in blended finance, which is the multilateral development banks and DFIs. And the call on this one is for them to modernise. And they were set up in the Bretton Woods era around trying to stabilise exchange rates and the global economy. And we've moved on. Our risk now is climate, not destabilise. Well, it's probably destabilised currency is still there, but we've figured out how to do that. So we've moved on. So we really need to see the whole multilateral system moving on with that. What does that mean? Share data. Multilaterals have been working in the emerging markets for decades. Their database on what risk really looks like in emerging markets as opposed to perceived risk is deep, and that data really needs to be shared with the private sector in order for that to, for the private sector to get comfortable with some of those risks, or at least be able to quantify them in a more effective way, rather than guessing what political or currency risk might be there. The second is to move to what many of you who from the private sector will know, and has been around as a mantra in private sector, to churn balance sheets through originate, bundle and distribute models. So this allows that recycling of the balance sheet constantly and impact. The third one is looking at how blended finance can operate at a national level, aligned with the NDCs or national decarbonisation plans, and how can that be a way to scale blended finance and bring blended finance into a more sort of accessible realm for many financial institutions. And finally, of course, their traditional role for MDDs and the multilateral sector is to de-risk. The final theme I just want to touch on very quickly is national enabling. And when we talk about this, we're talking about decarbonisation pathways. We need to see those. They need to be really clear and robust and built out in detail. They need to be aligned with carbon pricing. If we don't have carbon pricing that is effective, it may as well not be there, right? And the final one is the mainstreaming sustainable finance into regulation and the markets, so that it's not a new shiny toy. It's now part of the central mainstream finance sector. So I commend the report to you, and if you want to get in touch with me, I can put you onto the link where it is housed. We have seen a lot of people leaning in to give us feedback and also to say, how can I be a part of making these actions happen? And the final point I want to make is one that's been touched on a number of times, is we've also had people say, but what about the just element, the social element? You haven't touched on that here. What about the nexus with climate and nature? Between climate and nature, we haven't touched on that here. So these are other areas that we of course need to address.
Right. Thank you, Nikki. So is that currently a consultation process going on right now, and that you have a consultation version, or you've finished the report?
So the paper is now completed. So the consultation was done under Chatham House and very discreetly, because we felt that there were a lot of things that people wanted to say, but were a bit anxious perhaps about saying them very publicly. So that process has happened. But it's just the very first discussion paper. So we will be working on this at least during the course of the coming year. And there will be a deep dive and build out of a number of these themes.
Okay, great. So I think what Nikki has touched upon, there's two, I think, important things. One is about going beyond green, which is actually the title of this session. And the other one is about emerging markets. So this is the second half of the session title, which is Asia ready for the transition? So you kind of touched upon both. Just on the green, so there's a lot of the name transition is a little bit confusing, because sometimes you're talking about the transition of the whole economy towards net zero, and then you could be talking about a specific financing strategy supporting, say, high emitting sectors to push along their phase out of high emitting sectors, or it could be about them going on to the 1.5 degree roadmap as well. So it's a little bit confusing, and just to kind of advertise on the GFANS product here as a moderator. So the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is putting out a new guidance on what does an FI transition plan look like. And here we've identified 4 transition strategies. The first one is financing the green solutions. So that's the green that we were talking about earlier. And then the next one is financing the companies that are already aligned to 1.5 degrees. The next 2 are the bits that I think is very critical, especially in Asia, and that is the supporting the companies that are not currently aligned to 1.5 degrees, but helping them to get onto that pathway as soon as possible. And the last one is the managed phase out, or the early retirement of brown assets that are going to be stranded if they are left on its own. So those are the 4 different strategies that have been identified in that plan. And I guess we would like to talk about a little bit more about this financing of the hard to abate sectors next. And then hopefully, if we have time, we'd like to go on to talk about the emerging markets as well, and about the financing, the blended financing as well, although that's being covered a lot already in the MAS conference. So just turning on to the financing of the hard to abate sectors. So now starting the new round, Gillian, how can the financial sector best work with this sector?
Yeah. No, thanks, Yuki. I'll go quick because I think we're running short of time. But just to say that these sectors are really quite critical, because the hard-to-abate sectors are actually key constituents of the Asia economy and even Singapore's economy to a certain extent, right? So things like power, industry, chemicals, even agriculture, construction, right? These are pretty hard to abate. I think when I think of this, I'll think of it in terms of maybe 2 T's and 1 S. So the first T is transition, which I think we covered in some length already. Basically, it was important to us from day one, working with industry, that the taxonomies we developed had a transition category or color code, right? And it's sort of both, right? It's those who are sort of on a Paris-aligned pathway, or don't have a clear pathway now, but are expected to develop one over time. So what is that category that allows for financing to continue to be directed to transition? So it was very critical that the TAXO provide for that. The second T is transition plans, and it's great to hear about GFAN's work, right? Providing some guidance on transition plans, because frankly, when I speak with some of our FI friends, there is still some confusion around this, and I think it is a developing area that we will need to watch carefully and work on together. I think it's important, right? So FIs need their own transition plans, but they can also work with their clients on the client's transition plans, and that will help the real economy, right, which Nikki highlighted earlier. And what the FIs can do, I think, is obviously raise awareness of these sectoral pathways that Nikki talked about, because those are critical, and actually awareness levels are pretty low right now. So FIs can raise awareness of this among their clients. And financial institutions, the very best ones, and I've seen it a lot actually, they can actually go to clients because they know these clients very well, and actually suggest to them decarbonization strategies, long-term plans, and the clients do take on board these sort of advisory inputs. That said, I think if you're an FI sitting in the audience, please, there's no need to feel pressured to do it all at once, because I think it is a new area, right? And what was very interesting, I hope all of you have seen DBS's recent report, where they laid out their targets for their bringing down their Scope 3 financed emissions. It's definitely worth a read. I see some of you getting on your phones to look for it. Please do. I fully recommend it. It's a very, very interesting piece of work. And what they did was, they've set these targets for, I think, something like 7 sectors. And for 2 of the sectors, I think it was agribusiness and chemicals, DBS actually took a look at their clients and said, hey, wait a minute here, we don't even have enough data, right? There isn't even enough reporting data out there to set a realistic reduction target. So instead of putting out willy-nilly a target, what we'll do is we will set data reporting targets for these 2 sectors. So they will actually work with their clients to, and these are big clients, right, in these sectors, work with their clients to start reporting off these targets. And in a couple of years, we'll be in a better position to actually set reduction targets. And I thought that was really critical, because the reality is that for sectors, right, and I think, either Sean or Harry said this earlier, the picture won't be the same for everyone. It won't be the same for every entity, and it certainly won't be the same for every sector. And it's wonderful to start seeing our banks and FIs step up, realize that, and tailor their approach to these differences. The final point I want to make on this is S, and that's on solutions. So again, right, the Code Red report, I'm going to read it right after this. Solutions are important, right, because the reality is we need financing for these technological advancements that I spoke about at the start. Now, a lot of these new technologies are super new. They're super risky. In a traditional world, a lot of the FIs would be like, I'm not going to go near this thing, right? But the reality is we need investment in these technological solutions, proof of concepts, if we're going to have a hope and a prayer of decarbonizing in time. And I personally would really like to see a greater variety of financial institutions step forth. A lot of attention on banks all the time, right? But actually for some of these spaces, including the early stage financing, perhaps it's the PE VC players, perhaps it's the asset owners, the insurers coming in to provide cover for risk. All these players need to come to the table and contribute, and I'm really hopeful that we as MES can come and try and bring everyone together.
Thank you, Gillian. Yeah, so 2 T's and an S. Transition, and then transition planning. Oh, taxonomy is there as well? Okay. And
taxonomy, transition plan, solutions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Taxonomy. Okay, great. Thank you. So maybe Nikki, would you like to kind of respond to Gillian about some of the financing pathways that you are using in the hard-to-abate sectors. Oh, sorry, this is for Ritu. Yeah, sorry, apologies.
Sure. Engagement, I think, is a key part of what we are doing, and sharing and bringing together experts from different parts. So having a footprint over 70 countries, it helps us connect these sectors across the globe sometimes and to bring about best practice sharing. We haven't done such much successfully in Asia yet, but in Europe we have managed to do that. Sharing, the transition is a simple word, but actually this technology transition for these sectors is fairly complex. And I think everyone is still finding their way. It's a complex road each sector and each company is on. So I think that part is something that we can play a role, but I don't think it will really be a key role for financial institutions to play. We can be a catalyst, we can finance this, but we can be a partner in the journey. But I think a key part of this will come from the governments, industry bodies, regulators.
Okay. Mindful of time, let's move on to the other aspect that Nikki was raising, which is about emerging markets. So, moving, Calvin, sorry, we're not leaving you on screen, but Calvin, maybe you can kick us off on this discussion about how do you see the mobilization of finance into emerging markets and developing economies? Because this is where we are, I think, at a big critical issue right now. There's a lot of data now that says that during COVID, a lot of the financing, sustainable finance, has gone towards the developed markets, but the financing, both for the public and private financing, has really dropped in the emerging markets. And they're the ones that really need the most financing, new financing, for net zero transition. So what is the things that you are doing at AIIB?
Thanks much, Yuki. I'll try and make my comments short so we have a nice closure as well. AIIB as a MDB is necessarily counter-cyclical. We tend to move in where more commercially minded financial institutions would actually exist. Necessarily so, with respect to the COVID crisis, the bank actually launched a COVID response facility to respond to the crisis, to provide not just the financing for, say, vaccines and the necessary health equipment and so forth, but also to provide liquidity support as well to many of our members. Because AIB is an infrastructure-focused bank, we're also seeing that a lot of the infrastructure that's focused, that is green and sustainable, cannot be funded necessarily by government budgets or NDBs. So a lot of our work is actually also involved in trying to crowd in private sector investment as well. That is one of our metrics when we actually look at our investments in our private sector projects. The ability for us to crowd in other players, and also to ensure that we're actually not crowding out investors as well, which is sometimes a bit of a tricky, quite tricky that it's not easily achieved. I just want to make a quick connection with what I just said also to, I think, the comments being made about hard-to-abate sectors. I think one other area that could be explored, and something that MDBs are perhaps not in the best position to make happen, is the role of innovation in terms of finding solutions for hard-to-abate sectors. One of the pleasures of being the only one dialing in to the CBI conference is that I can Google some topics which interest me. And I noticed that the Australian government has actually provided a new grant facility to actually, it's nice small grants which are going to incentivize very innovative entrepreneurs and university professors to work on hard-to-abate sectors as well, because it's not just a technology issue, it's also an innovation issue. And I think the other aspect that we also perhaps sometimes fail to acknowledge as well is that hard-to-abate sectors are not necessarily difficult to abate technologically, but they're hard to abate because they're not, they come against socially constraints as well, whereby particular sectors employ a certain number of people, so it's actually quite politically hard to get to scale up these sectors as well. And I think that's where the role of, say, NGOs and universities and research institutions can come into play. So anyways, a couple of quick thoughts as we roll into the last minutes of our time here.
Yeah. Thank you for that excellent timekeeping. Yeah, so thank you very much. Does anyone want to add anything on the and respond to Kelvin before we start closing up?
Can I just make a quick comment on the hard to abate sectors, if I might? There's a really interesting program that the World Economic Forum's been running since 2020 called Mission Possible Partnerships. I think somebody was a Mission Impossible fan. Anyway, this has since, and in fact very recently, now been a technical collaboration with the SBTI, which is really important. It addresses, from an industry perspective, 4 sectors: steel, aluminium, cement and chemicals. And from the transport sector, aviation, shipping and trucking. Within this initiative, and all those sectors collectively represent about 30% of GHG emissions. So this is an important, reduction, targeted reduction program pathway. Within the initiative, there is a financing pillar, and it looks specifically, and it's linked to the financing, the Net Zero Transition Initiative. And this has some very deep expertise and work being done by the industries themselves, alongside some fairly significant think tanks around sector financing plans, the de-risking blueprints, and transition financing mechanisms. And the aim is for near-term capital to be deployed so that we have action on these. And it goes down to as far as how many electric vehicles will be needed, how many ships will need to be decarbonised, how many. So it's very, very specific when it gets into some of the work here. So this is being done. It's a very optimistic way of looking at it, I think, because these pathways, when we talk about them, we don't just sort of talk about them as something we wish would happen. They actually are happening, and they're available publicly. So we should be excited about this, and they will, because of their supply chain and value chain integration into this region. We will see a lot of that being cascaded here.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really nice way of rounding up this session, because I think what we saw through our speakers is that there are a lot of different actors here, and they are each doing a lot inside what their remit is currently, and that remit is also evolving as well. So what MAS or an investment is doing today might not be the same 10 years on. Definitely we didn't see central banks doing these kind of things 10 years ago, as it was pointed out earlier by other speakers. And so it's an evolving agenda, and the roles are evolving. There are more and more players coming into the market, and this is why talent development is so important as well. And we have the whole economy to transform within the next 10 years for 2030, and then by 2050. So a lot to do, but everyone, all hands are on deck. And we hope that this has inspired you about the opportunities and that the challenges are being discussed and thought about with many people. And hopefully you are invited to join if you are not already. Thank you very much.
Great panel. In an event with Nikki and Don Canuck, one of Nikki's colleagues, a few months ago, there was a call for fast-track certification. So today we're launching the Climate Bonds Initiative Fast-Track Certification Scheme as a result of that that session.
Nicely done.
So it's all online. Should you want to do it in areas like solar and transport and so on, it can happen very, very quickly. Should someone decide the opportunity to go to market is imminent, let's do it quickly, which does sometimes happen in treasuries. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for the support, by the way, that you've shown. Ritu, it's wonderful to see you. We've only met online and finally in person. And of course, the work MAS is doing right now is fantastic. I mean, hey, I don't want to give you an easy pass here. It's not enough, right? It's not enough. But they're moving at pace, at speed, and what they've been saying, the rhetoric so far, is warming of the heart, given the circumstances we face. It's really good. Thank you so much. We're going to have a short break. There are refreshments outside. Please talk to the people next to you. Cook up deals. We need a pipeline of deals. Or come and grab me, or Ritu, for example, who won't be able to say she'll invest, but she can at least talk, because hasn't got that kind of role, but she will at least talk to you about what's happening and where the buy side is going. Back here in 20 minutes. While we're waiting for the rest of the physical audience to come into the room, I just want to remind everyone, have a look at the app you've been sent a link to, because that's the forum in which people are exchanging views, where you can find like-minded people. You can talk to people in the Climate Bonds team if you've got questions, and generally find out more about green bonds. Also, the Climate Bonds website, which, as you would guess, is called ClimateBonds.net. If you search for Climate Bonds, you'll find it, is full of resources, reports, including around transitions and taxonomies. And today, we're launching a fast-track certification scheme I mentioned earlier. We're launching our finalised cement industry taxonomy criteria. And we're also launching a 101 ideas for governments to get to 1.5, fiscally efficient, in draft form, looking for comment. That is, we're beseeching, we're asking, we're pleading with you. Tell us what you think. And we'll keep improving that with the idea of a more substantial launch for the COP in Egypt a little later this year. A lot of the work that we do, that everyone needs to do in this market, is iterative. That is, we need to keep improving. We're not going to be perfect, at least not until we've managed to stabilise the global climate. We'll keep learning and keep improving. And that includes in the detail, like the 101 guide that we're publishing, where we'll continue to ask for ideas from a vast group of people around the world, like yourselves, that are thinking about this and trying to think about what to do. The next panel that we're about to run is on the topic of taxonomies. Now, I call taxonomies the shopping lists for the future. It is a shopping list. You've heard me say, if you've been here earlier today, that we need to make an understanding of what to do simple and clear. While we have formulas, we will slow development and growth of this market. If we can find ways to say, here's how you tell whether something qualifies, it's pretty simple, things will change quite quickly. Financial markets grow on the back of commoditization and standardization. That underpins the theory behind all of this. A little bit of a story about the history of taxonomies. The green bond market grew out of an initiative by the World Bank and the European Investment Bank before that, the real initiator, but theirs was called the Climate Awareness Bond in 2008, to attract new investors to their books. In the ESG framing that had been common in the 10 years prior to that, the analysis was about entities, was about companies, not about what companies were doing, except insofar it affected the tracking filters, ESG filters, on top of companies. What that meant was there weren't many companies that qualified. For the level of equity investment at the time, there were more than enough. But the bond market is A, larger, and B, dominated by higher rated. And there weren't that many companies that were high rated that were meeting the ESG criteria that were common at that time, including a lot of development banks that were being excluded who didn't have equity for a start and wanted to try and place investments. So when people were looking at ESG, they were trying to find a company that qualified they could invest in. The climate awareness bond issued by the European Investment Bank was designed to bring new investors to the book who hadn't been part of the European Investment Bank's fixed income client list prior, because they were investing the proceeds in activities that were seen to be of interest to, in this case, Scandinavian investors. It worked. Very soon afterwards, the World Bank copied the idea in the Green Bond. But a little bit of a secret history of the World Bank Green Bond. When they first knocked on the door, Yolanda might remember this, she was around then. They first knocked on the door of investors in Scandinavia and said, we want to do a green bond like the European Investment Bank. Here's where we plan to use the proceeds. Swedish investors, who can be very skeptical and very tough, said, I'm just not sure about your portfolio that you're allocating funds to. And also, your CEO, Robert Zoellick, at the time, is not exactly known as a greenie. The World Bank had just funded a coal-fired power station in South Africa, very controversially at the time, and they said, oh, we're not convinced. Cicero was then approached at the University of Oslo's Climate Change Research Centre by SEB Bank in what was a daring and great idea. Let's get a trusted body to review what they're doing and see if that can assuage the concerns of the investors in Sweden. Well, it worked. By getting an independent review by a trusted actor, in this case, the University of Oslo's Climate Change Research Centre, an internationally well-regarded institution, the green bond from the World Bank was able to be placed, but there were some changes made. This isn't common, this isn't in the official history of the World Bank. But at that time, they had included the retrofitting of coal-fired power stations in their portfolio of green assets. Climate scientists have never been happy about this, let me be very clear about that. But the World Bank at the time was still including that as green. Cicero said, oh, I don't think I can sign off on that. After a bit of argy-bargy, the World Bank did remove those loans from their portfolio. Very significant win. A climate focus became the dominant agenda in that particular age, and scientists had the final say about what qualified. Two important lessons for the development of this market. The independent review was established as a norm. It did take a few years for the European Investment Bank to catch up, but then they've tended to be seen as a bit more trusted on their climate credentials, especially as now they've become a climate bank. 50% of all lending goes towards climate mitigation, and the other 50% on things like roads has to be climate resilient. So there's a whole resilience agenda added there. We established the idea of the independent review. Things took off. But in that science advice was this kernel of an idea of if we could systemize and commoditize this advice, maybe things will grow really fast. When in 2013, the IFC issued $2 billion benchmark bonds that were sold out 2.5 times oversubscribed in 1.5 hours, which excited the market and got everyone thinking, especially the corporate world, this could actually work. We also launched the climate bonds taxonomy and certification scheme. And this was a guidance to the market. About 15% of the global green bonds market now uses the certification scheme based on taxonomy. In 2014-15, the People's Bank of China adopted one of the recommendations we'd made in the Green Finance Task Force, headed by Dr. Ma Jun at the time, to establish green bonds market and a taxonomy, the Green Projects Catalogue. And they said, because we can't afford to allow interpretation by provinces and actors, otherwise there'll be all sorts of rubbish. So that has grown. That has been a critical piece of architecture for the growth of the Chinese green bond market, now the world's second largest, and we think possibly the world's largest in this coming year for a variety of reasons. a couple of years later, the European Commission agreed to another recommendation from the high-level expert group on sustainable finance I was a member of to establish one, and now we have the EU taxonomy, which is, let's just say, driving awareness in Europe. It's being used not just for green bonds, but also for the sustainable investment disclosure regime that affects all companies, major companies, banks, and investors in Europe, who will be disclosing annually around their sustainable investments. That taxonomy is a bit more a work in progress. We'll hear a little bit more from Nadia Humphreys in a minute, who will join us. But you can sort of see how this has gone. And now, of course, we have the Singaporean taxonomy. We have the Vietnamese taxonomy. We will soon have the Thai taxonomy. We hope to have, next year, the Hong Kong taxonomy. The Indian taxonomy has been published in draft form. And I'm going to say we've had a bit of involvement as Climate Bonds in all of these to varying degrees, with an objective of keeping them broadly aligned. You heard in the earlier session about the need for harmonisation. It's a work in progress, but we are a long way along that road. There's necessary tailoring for different markets, but broad acceptance. There are differences. Yolanda might pick out a couple of those, because she's been in the thick of those, but the methodology is largely the same, is the key thing to note. And it's going global. Taxomania, we like to call it. A key part of these taxonomies, a key feature, is the science base, the necessity of reflecting necessary ambition. Yes, make it easy, but yes, be rigorous. Sort out some of the boundary issues, and above all, avoid the accusations of greenwashing that investors don't want to have to be tarred with. Heading off problems is a key part of it. In some ways, it's also now become a risk predictor. That is, taxonomies are being used by investors in Europe as a universe of investments that are less likely to be negatively impacted by future policy changes, and more likely to be positively supported by policy impact. In other words, a lower risk universe. Now that is exciting, and that's driving price movements and all sorts of other things. But let's hear more about it. I would like to invite onto the stage, first, Yolanda Chung, who's the head of sustainability at DBS and has a history as long as your arm working on sustainable finance. One of the heroes of sustainable finance. I'd also like to invite on screen, and hopefully our tech people can get the screen going, Eugene Wong, who's the CEO with Sustainable Finance Institute of Asia, used to be at the Malaysian Securities Commission, and is currently advising the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, made up of central banks and regulators, on ASEAN approaches to transition taxonomy. And if I can get one of my team just to see if we can get the screen working, that'd be wonderful, because we need to be able to see our speakers on screen. And also will be joining us in a minute, Nadia Humphreys, who is the head of Sustainable Financial Solutions at Bloomberg, based in London, and also a member of the Platform on Sustainable Finance with me in Europe. But perhaps more pertinently, she's a bit senior than me because she's the co-rapporteur of the usability work group of the Platform on Sustainable Finance, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that. I'm going to sit down, and here they all are. Nadia, thank you for joining us at 8 a.m. in London. Luckily, it wasn't 5 a.m. She got a terribly frightening email alert earlier that worried her about her sleep. And thank you, Eugene, for joining us from Vietnam. I'm going to ask Nadia to take us into this discussion first, if I may. Nadia, can you tell us about where we are in Europe and what's happening next, especially around usability? No audio, folks.
Shawnee, is this any better? Can you hear me?
Much better. Thank you, Nadia.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for inviting me. And apologies, Yolanda, to see you sitting there quite lonely in the panel. Well done on the hybrid event, Sean. And thank you very much for the kind introduction. In terms of the European market, maybe if I just start with kind of what we're seeing in terms of demand. So I recently looked at the European ETF market. And what I looked at was whether or not there are flows to sustainable products. So in Europe, there's a classification system. And forgive me for using numbers, but an Article 8 or 9 product is deemed to be sustainable to varying degrees. So an 8 favours environmental or social characteristics, and a 9 has environmental or social objectives. And when I looked at the European market, what I was seeing is about 25% of AUM is sitting on these sustainable products. And last year, I saw that for the first time, 51% of flows started to move into these sustainable products. So over-tipping those flows into normal or non-sustainable. There's been some bad press about ESG and sustainability this year, and I looked very recently at year-to-date flows into these products, and really interestingly, 58%. So it's still growing. And for me, what does that mean? That means that there is real demand for sustainable financial products. And there is really, in my opinion, no better tool for this than a common framework like a taxonomy that directs and clarifies exactly how much sustainability you are getting, given that there is clearly demand for this. And I think particularly where that is useful in the Asian market is to attract international capital, being able to very clearly articulate and explain how environmentally sustainable your investment product is. Using a narrative like a taxonomy is going to be critically important. Now, Sean asked me to also just touch upon a couple of things in the EU. So one thing, and Sean, forgive me, because this is absolutely my favourite anecdote, and it is totally stolen from you. But a taxonomy is a very complicated beast, and I think what Sean does is he relates it to an electric car, which the nuts and bolts and technology that goes into creating one is incredibly complex. But at the end of the day, you sit in it and press the go button, and it starts to move. We are still in that place of construction in the taxonomy. And so what you will see next week is a report from the platform to the European Commission on usability in the market, not only of taxonomy, but the broader sustainable finance framework. I will admit the latest draft, it's just shy of 180 pages, so it's not something to digest in one sitting, but it does cover some very useful advice from the platform that ultimately is from the market to the Commission on how to make this framework more usable, particularly to financial markets. And I would definitely point people to that report in terms of kind of, with hindsight, lessons learned on adoption of taxonomies locally, and definitely the way to stimulate financial flows rather than create a cumbersome or burdening system. I'll pause there, Sean, and allow the other speakers to introduce themselves as well.
Thank you so much. That comment about flows going into sustainable finance, percentage flows, is really interesting. We've had this conversation in Europe, and Rahul Sheth, I wanted to get you to come down here, and because I've got to ask you a question. I was asking Rahul yesterday at a Standard Chartered event, what was happening with the depressed bond market in Asia, and what share of green and thematic bonds were. And you told me an astounding figure, Rahul. Come on, just go to the microphone for a second. What share of bonds that are green or sustainable, Rahul, in the Asian market, despite the reduction in bond market? How's it going? How's it traveling?
Trust Sean to put you on the spot. Yeah, so the number was actually 33%. So when you look at this year, where Asia ex-Japan G3 bonds are down, bonds themselves just are 50% down in Asia. The most interesting piece of statistic that I can find for clients here is 33% of all bonds, conventional or otherwise, are ESG labeled. That was 8% 3 years back, 20% about last year, 33 now. That's something encouraging.
Thank you. That's pretty extraordinary that this is happening anyway. So that's a lesson learned for all of us. As bond markets rebound, you're going to see an extraordinary change. This is my segue now to Eugene. Tell us about the work of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, Eugene, and also what you're seeing around appetite, because you and I have been talking about green bonds in particular ever since you were working for regulators when you were Malaysian Securities Commission before. It's changed a lot. What are you seeing and what are you doing?
Hi, Sean. Well, first of all, I must commend technology. Raul actually beamed into the conference I'm at in Hanoi, and now I'm beaming into the conference he's at in Singapore. So, Sean, you and I have been working a lot on green bonds and sharing a vision. And we first started in Southeast Asia with the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, if you recall, and that's something that you were involved in as well. And in ASEAN at that time, we decided in 2017 that we needed to have a common definition, and we wanted to experiment with one. So we used the IGMA Green Bond Principles to create the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. But again, you remember, Sean, it was a very interesting experiment because we decided to specifically exclude fossil fuels. Now, no one else had done that at that time, and I remember us having this conversation, and you were awfully encouraging that we should do this, and we did do it. In 2018, we released the ASEAN Sustainability Bond Standards and the ASEAN Social Bond Standards, and today we have 26 over billion in label green, social, and sustainable bonds, and another 3 over billion in specifically aligned. So this kind of goes to show that A, investors do appreciate an ASEAN asset class, and B, it's actually okay to provide more ambitious definitions because there will be investors who come for it. So what we're doing in ASEAN right now is really phase 2. The second phase is really to get all our member states on board. And as you know, there's great diversity in our member states. So we have countries with very different starting points, very different social and economic perspectives and situations, and of course, very different resources. I always like to tell people this to illustrate the diversity in the ASEAN states. So the highest GDP per capita per annum amongst ASEAN states is 60,000, and the lowest is 1,300. So how do you really bring countries that are so diverse together? Well, you can let everyone go off and have their own national taxonomies, which obviously, like you shared, is something that we do encourage countries to do because all member states will be addressing their national priorities through their national taxonomies. But we also do want something to reflect the national ambition. We want something to be able to bring all our member states along this ambitious pathway to reach a common destination. And we must be able to encourage them. So you know that story many of us here, or many of us have experienced about kids who drop out of school simply because they can't keep up with the requirements, they can't keep up with the demands of what they're expected to do, but really they could have done quite well if they're given the right encouragement and the right tools. So it's the same in Southeast Asia. What we want to do is to ensure that everyone starts the sustainability journey right now. We'll have countries who are not equipped in terms of data. We'll have countries who are not equipped in terms of infrastructure. We'll have countries who are not equipped in terms of resources. But that doesn't mean that they can't be and won't be. How do we start that process going? And that is what the ASEAN taxonomy is about. The ASEAN taxonomy is really the overarching guide for ASEAN. It's the common language for ASEAN. It's the guide rail for ASEAN. It's supposed to bring us all along on that journey. We may all be at different starting points, but we want to be at the same ending point. And therein lies the big opportunity and also the big challenge. What does it mean to have a taxonomy that's inclusive, that's the overarching guide, and importantly, is going to facilitate transition in the region? So we've constructed the ASEAN taxonomy to do two things. The first is we don't want to ignore the global efforts that are being undertaken, right? I mean, taxonomies were really created to reduce fragmentation, but if you have 30 taxonomies floating around, it's just going to increase fragmentation. So the first thing we've done with the taxonomy is actually to ensure that it is, in terms of design, interoperable. Right? We have to worry about the thresholds later on, but in terms of design, it needs to be interoperable with the major taxonomy. So let's just compare against the EU taxonomy. The EU taxonomy has 6 environmental objectives. We have 4. Those 4 and 6 virtually encompass the same things. We use ISIC as a classification system. The EU uses NACE. We know we can reconcile those two. EU has the DNSH criteria. We've got that. But we've thrown in an extra criteria, which is remedial measures to transition. I think, Sean, you and I talked about this too, right? Because we can't get to that perfect point immediately. we might have to actually do things which we prefer not to, but we have to do it. So let's see how we can remediate those things, how we can mitigate those impacts. So that's additional for us, is to facilitate transition. We have a foundation framework that's principles-based. Essentially, that's an activity classification system. We recognize that there'll be countries and companies who can't come on with the data immediately, but hey, let's not stop them. Let's start them on that journey. And we have a plus standard, which basically reflects all the technical screening criteria which other taxonomies are using. That's based on the traffic light system. So the whole taxonomy is based on the traffic light system. And the traffic light system, again, really enables us to concentrate a bit on the transition. So back to transition, we have a plus standard, which has a technical screening criteria. What's going to be a bit different with this plus standard compared to what's happening in other places is that we don't have a single threshold for economic activities. Well, in fact, we can have up to 3 thresholds. And why is that the case? It's again intentional, because we're trying to facilitate transition. So let's take energy as an example. So if we say, well, you know, our threshold for energy is like the EU, 100 grams per kilowatt hour. Not everyone's going to be able to do that. But, you know, maybe people can do 250, maybe they can do 350. So we had 3 thresholds. We'll be able to encourage our member states to use these 3 thresholds, assemble it in a way that they can use to facilitate the transition journey. I often use this metaphor. It's like crossing a river. So, you know, the river's broad and narrow differently at different points. And if you had 3 stones to use as stepping stones to cross the river, and people at different points of the river, they'll arrange the stepping stones differently. And that's what we want our member states to do, the tiers. But I think importantly, we also encourage companies within our member states to be able to move on to something higher than what their country is using, because this is about getting on that journey as soon as you're ready and making yourselves ready as soon as possible. So really, the ASEAN taxonomy is the overarching guide and common language. It's meant to keep us all honest, keep us all within the guide rails. It's meant to complement our national initiatives and move us as quickly as possible, because we know that perfect isn't good enough, but we must be ambitious enough and we must avoid the lock-ins. And I'll just stop here for now, Sean.
Fantastic, Eugene. Thanks. Quite a journey. Yolanda, we first met when you were in Standard Chartered. That's Rahul Sheth's organisation a while ago. But I discovered recently that we had a common friend, Tessa Tennant, who was the doyenne, one of the founders of the responsible investment industry, really. So you've been on a long journey of trying to drive change in multiple institutions, and then you've had this very cool gig at DBS for a while. And one of the things you've done is taxonomy work, right? Implementation. Of course, banks and corporations and so on ask, is this going to be hard? Is this going to be difficult? I mean, can't I just keep it easy and have, say, like a nice, gentle 2050 target? Can you tell us about your experience internally?
Great. Well, every time I speak to Sean, he betrays my age by suggesting that we've known each other for decades. When DBS first thought about, okay, we are headquartered in Singapore, our primary markets are emerging economies, what should we do about sustainable finance? We kept thinking about what would be realistic. And then we decided to develop this transition finance framework and taxonomy, which is considered really foolhardy to do, because taxonomy should be the work of markets, regulators, think tanks like CBI, not a bank to try to dictate what is right or wrong. But the approach that we took was to look at the origin of the word taxonomy. It's always very funny that we try to appropriate scientific terms, adopt it in finance, but taxonomy really is talking about what science says. And we go down to the root, look at what science says, rather than thinking what society says, what public opinion says, what the economy says will be feasible. So I think I really agree with what Eugene said, that a traffic light system that many of the recent taxonomies have adopted is a very realistic way of understanding what is that label referring to. We want to get credibility to the things that we finance. If certain economic activities are not in the taxonomy, that tells you something. That doesn't preclude financing later on, but it does tell investors the signposting of the attributes, whether it's sustainability or not, of those economic activities. So that's one thing that we have done. We look at science. Another thing that we approach taxonomy is that because we were thinking about transition finance, and we looked at what was in the market, most of the transition finance guidance is very principles based. So everyone is trying to skirt around the edges, not talk about what actually is transition. And as a result, we find that it is a void that we would attempt to fill. So for our taxonomy at DBS, we didn't try to map every economic activity under the sun. We only map the economic activities that we already finance. And we put out a table looking at the alignment with the international best practices, such as the taxonomy that CBI has, and ICMA and others. But we try to make it beyond principles based. We also want to approach transition finance not only relying on the taxonomy. So when we are evaluating transition finance deals, we really would be looking at the asset or the facility or the activity that we are financing, plus the borrower, the counterparty, the entity that we are financing. Do they really are on a pathway to transition? Because we are not going to finance a thermal coal company's individual biomass plant and say that is transition. But we have done something to that effect because we have looked at the borrower's overall strategy. So I think for us, the challenges we try to overcome by looking at not just the individual asset attributes, but also at the organization.
How hard has this been? Not so much to develop the taxonomy, but implementation, looking at lending programs, getting bank officers engaged. Has that been straightforward? Or has it been really challenging?
It has been challenging with clients who looked at transition, that particular label, under a taxonomy as some sort of inferior label, that they believe that I would prefer being called green if I could. I don't want transition. So it took a little bit of convincing and education, and I think with the emergence of a lot of the recent taxonomies focusing on transition in the amber part of the traffic light has helped. It has been also difficult internally at the bank because people actually talk about transition finance with different interpretations. Some people actually talk about transition finance interchangeably with sustainable finance because they're thinking, oh, I'm transitioning the economy, hence it is transition finance. But we apply that label very judiciously. We look at the organizational strategy, we look at the individual asset that we are financing, we benchmark it against a reference pathway that is hopefully 1.5, if not, not too high temperature indication. So with all that coming into play, we have not done that many transition finance deals, but we're quite proud of some of the ones that we've done, including some that are quite contentious because the counterparties involved, the borrowers involved, would be the fossil fuel clients looking to divest, diversify, decarbonize.
Nadia, in the European taxonomy, we've incorporated transition within the broader sustainable universe there. The transition terms got confused and muddied and isn't very, I think, or at least this is what people are telling me in Singapore today, isn't very visible in the European taxonomy. We've also got enabling, we've got resilience and so on. I'm wondering your thoughts about the utility, given you've got a broader perspective on the bond market in Europe as well. And then I also would like you to pick up on the utility question, what sort of things we're doing to make the electric car easier to push the button on, to give everyone a flavour.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I think transition, you're completely correct, is actually widely misunderstood for the EU. So the narrative around the EU taxonomy is that the thresholds are very high. There's very limited numbers of companies that are seen to be substantially contributing to at least the mitigation or adaptation objectives as written in the current Climate Delegated Act. Actually, the concept of transition exists, Sean, as you rightly point out. So there are transitional activities. So, for example, in manufacturing, steel, cement, etc., tracks the EU emissions trading system, which will have a trajectory to decarbonise over time. So those thresholds will change. But similarly, transition is actually baked into the technical screening criteria. So I'll give you an example. If you build a house, the expectation is on the energy performance being at a very high standard, ultimately top 15% of primary energy demand, or EPC-A in kind of local European terms, of a brand new property. But that's not to say that if you have a very low and energy inefficient property, you can't improve it. So there's a separate technical screening criteria that looks at renovation and says, look, we want you to deliver 30% energy efficiency. That's great, because that doesn't mean that you hit this EPC-A level at the very maturity of that investment. It's just that you deliver 30% energy efficiency, which is clearly critical in Europe because you have a lot of old housing stock. And so you still want to encourage that movement. The other thing that we've really noticed, Sean, just in terms of data, so there is an obligation right now on European companies to report something called the eligible portion of revenue, capital expenditure, and operating expenses aligned to the taxonomy. So eligible just means, is it captured? And then next year, you have to start reporting this alignment figure. What we've observed in the market, so there's about 2,000 companies in scope for this reporting. Already of them, just over 1,000 have started reporting these eligibility figures. And actually what we're seeing is 50%, so just over 500 of them, are already voluntarily reporting alignment, so starting on that journey a little bit earlier in terms of testing out the process. One of the metrics that we are really seeing, and rightly so, is that the capital expenditure values, those are being aligned to the taxonomy, i.e. there's a commitment at maturity of that expenditure that you deliver a substantial contribution and do no harm. You have the opportunity to invest. So capital expenditure, ultimately funded or not funded by debt instruments, is the most important metric of transition. And quite rightly, look, turnover, yeah, it's not, and that's true. There are not many companies today that are performing and making revenue in a way that is aligned to 2050 net zero. Correct. But actually the place you want to focus in is use of proceeds of debt instruments and capital expenditure that is aligning itself to these taxonomy criteria. And focusing on those numbers ultimately will yield you a turnover value. And when you look at financial organisations, they're required to report both. So there's forward-looking capital expenditure, and they're reporting the turnover or revenue. And so you've got this current performance versus future performance metric that is reported today and gives a much cleaner picture. So when we start to play around with the data, Sean, there is already a transitional picture emerging. And I think often the narrative is forgotten there, and there's a lot of narrative that the numbers are very small. And what I see in the media quoted is typically a turnover-based numbers at the revenue performance, which is fair. So I think that maybe answers the first question. You talked a little on utility. So I'd mentioned just over 1,000 companies have reported their taxonomy. They have a very strict structure by which they do that. Are they having problems doing it? I think the answer is yes. Sure. It's a new process and it's a complicated process. We have observed in the report that you will see next week, a number of teething problems. Even sometimes in technical screening criteria, like we in the platform are asking, can I objectively determine yes, no? If Sean looks at a company and Nadia looks at a company, do we both say yes, it meets these technical screening criteria? In not all cases is that possible. So some of them are a little bit subjective. They'll say words like minimize. Sean and I might have different opinions about what minimize means and whether a company meets that. So that there is a layer of complexity. We've asked the Commission just to give some supplementary guidance and support to the market to help them through that. And then probably the biggest ask, and I think this touches on Eugene's point a little earlier, is international application. So one thing we've observed in the market is non-EU companies are reporting using the EU taxonomy. So not their local taxonomies, but the EU. This includes Mexico, the US. Obviously, it includes UK and Norway with quite high numbers. They are not actually in scope to have to report, but are choosing to. And we've been approached by a number of companies that say, my investors really want this taxonomy number. I don't really know what it means. Now, trickled in the EU taxonomy is cross-references to a lot of EU legislation. I'll give you a very basic example. Like if I operate in an area of water stress, I have an appropriate license to do so. If I'm applying that internationally, I may be operating in an area of water stress and there is no licensing provision. I can't go in my local jurisdiction and get such a license. So what does that mean for me? Does that mean I definitely shouldn't be operating in areas of water stress, or does that mean I kind of can as long as I do it sensibly, and how do I show sensible? So those international comparisons of criteria are really critically important. And you will see we have actually in our usability report devoted an entire chapter to international operability and the importance of this. And also for the EU ultimately to recognise reporting. I think the main point Eugene was making, and it's quite right, although it's principles based, is when it is applied, you don't want a Asian company having to report on 2 different taxonomies or multiple different taxonomies to satisfy investors. So it is really important that if I am reporting under the Singapore taxonomy, that an EU investor can apply that value and state for my EU sustainable financial product, that company counts as X% aligned because it is aligned to its local taxonomy. And if there is one place of advocacy, and I know Eugene and I talk about this a lot, is kind of really pushing on that international operability for it to work over the long term. Sean, I hope that appropriately addresses your question.
Perfect. I think, Eugene, this is a segue to you. From ASEAN, this equivalence issue, this is going to dog us unless we can sort it out, right? But you've got a problem within ASEAN, haven't you? Or do you think that's going to work between, say, Singapore and Indonesia and Vietnam? Tell us where that thinking is about, regional equivalence.
Yeah, well, this is the big challenge that we have in ASEAN. As you know, ASEAN's not quite the regional bloc that the EU is. Everyone's a sovereign state, and it's really a cooperative arrangement under a charter. So the way ASEAN approaches things is through consensus and through inclusivity. But that's, in a way, a strength, Sean, because if we left everyone to their own devices, then we'd have a very fragmented investment regime. And I think, Nadia's point about the CAPEX is absolutely important. We want investments directed into this area. And the way you direct investments into this area is if people who are putting the money in understand what they're putting their money into and are comfortable with it. So we really need to kind of like bring everyone into a journey of transparency, right? If you can't do something, it's all right. My mother used to say, always tell the truth as long as you know you're going the right way. And that's what we should do right here. So you notice that with the Plus standard, which is our equivalent technical screening criteria, we actually are open to having multiple tiers. And the reason why we're having multiple tiers is eventually, hopefully, one of those tiers will resonate with each of our member countries. So every member country has a tier that they could look at. Now, they disclose that tier. Is that going to be the level that we really want from them? Yes, eventually, but perhaps not today. But we want them to be able to set a target to say, well, I'm at tier 3 today, and I want to move up to tier 2 in 10 years, and another 10 years we're at tier 1. That's what we want them to do. That's the ambition we want them to create. Now, if they can do that, then of course within ASEAN we will have an understanding where everyone is at. If we can make this disclosure very transparent, then it comes back to Nadia's point, right? That other jurisdictions will say, well, we recognize what these guys are trying to do. They can't, and we don't expect them to get to a particular level immediately. I mean, transition is about avoiding social and economic dislocations anyway, but they've got a plan to get there, right? It's about the plan. They're going to allocate CAPEX towards this. So that settles the interoperability issue, whether it's amongst the ASEAN member states or it's ASEAN and the rest of the world. And I also wanted to touch on something Yolanda raised. I think it's really, really important that we understand transition is really not about kicking the can down the road or backloading. And again, this is where the tiers in the taxonomy are important, because we need people to be very clear that there is a plan to move up that tier sort of regime, that they are improving consistently. we don't want this backloaded, right? So 2050 is my net zero target, but hang on, I'm only getting to tier 1 in 2049. That's not what we want. We don't want the backloading. So the tiers are meant for you to be able to chart a pathway. And that's how we hope that this will work.
Okay. Well, it sounds good, although I suspect there's lots of areas to argue and it could be complicated. And for that reason, I'm going to ask someone at a bank whether this is navigable, because you're going to have different taxonomies in different countries. You've had to look at this, Yolanda. Is he mad?
No, we agree with what Eugene is trying to do for ASEAN. And similarly, the individual ASEAN countries' taxonomy will be consistent with the ASEAN version. What I think would be important for all of us to bear in mind is, what if there is no taxonomy? There was, not so long ago, there wasn't any taxonomies for us to fall back on, and we look at the very crude, broadly described, very nebulously defined green categories under IGMA's first version of green bond principles. And we thought, okay, well, if it is at individual organizations' discretion, then a lot of things go. So I think for a bank, when we look at a variety of taxonomies, what we want to follow would be ultimately what investors want. And we know investors do come in a spectrum. And we also know investors don't pore over the 100 pages of prospectus trying to work out, is it aligned with what we want to or mandated to invest. Hence, the emergence of taxonomies to make it easier, to make it straightforward, that is usable. So I think taxonomy does serve a very important signal. It's not the be-all, end-all. I'm very glad that there is actually a very contentious debate when the EU taxonomy was trying to work out, do we include gas, do we include nuclear? Because we know those industries are trying to lobby very hard to be included, knowing capital will be deployed to the green assets in the not so distant future. It's not as if they feel taxonomies don't matter, whether we are in it or not, we'll get financing. No, they know the consequences of being included in the taxonomy is huge. So I think we see a role for common framework when we have competing taxonomies. We will look at what our primary investor base will be demanding.
Yolanda's referring to the European Commission's European Parliament's recent adoption of an amendment to the taxonomy, which brought in nuclear and gas. I'm going to talk about net gas, though. The nuclear is restricted, but is in there. And look, while I'm frankly not a big fan of nuclear, although some of the smaller reactors look interesting, it is low carbon. Let's be clear about that. So if you're going to do something which is low carbon, it's better to do that than a coal plant, no doubt about it. The gas inclusion, which was a deft political compromise by the President of the European Commission when pushed by Emmanuel Macron in Paris and Angela Merkel in Germany, it's got so many caveats on it, it's a Pyrrhic victory for the gas industry. So the headline was, I had calls from governments in ASEAN, so Europe's green-lighted gas now. We can get gas in our taxonomy. Well, the headline is bad. It's very confusing. But in practice, you can only build a gas plant if you're replacing a coal plant. And then you can only build it to 15% of the capacity of the coal plant. And then you have to prove that you couldn't have built a wind and a solar farm instead of that plant. And you have to make sure that within 15 years, it's very low carbon. In other words, there aren't getting many plants built. This is impossible. So it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. Understand that. We'll be publishing something about that soon to provide some more guidance. But it's messy because the headline is confusing. Given the conversation on the IPCC and the International Energy Agency right now is around the incredible leakage from the gas sector. We have, in the first delegated act of the European Commission, said that we must be measuring life cycle emissions. We provided an agnostic measure of emissions, 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour in the energy sector, but you also have to measure emissions from wellhead to usage, because we found, and look at some of the maps we published in newspapers lately, this huge leakage in the Russian gas pipeline and also in Texas. and also in other parts of the world, in Turkmenistan, which is blowing out all our figures, whilst Germany has increased by 50% its usage of gas up to the war in Ukraine, for reasons we now understand were political meddling by Russia, let's just call it that way. Their actual emissions profile seems to have grown much more once you take into account the leakage factors across the life cycle. So these are the sort of tough discussions we're having now in understanding taxonomy. But the good news is we're having those discussions at taxonomy development. So for those people who don't have time to follow the science, because to be honest, it's complicated, there are all these bodies, including the MAS-led group in Singapore, which, Nadia, you've been on too, haven't you? And I'm going to ask you about any differences you see so far, just for full disclosure for everyone, between where we're going in Singapore and where we've been in Europe around this, because these are the fora where these things are being discussed and being sorted out to make it easier for the rest of us. Nadia, are we on the same page between Singapore and Europe, or are there differences that are problematic? Tell us what you're allowed to tell us.
Absolutely. Well, there are certain amounts of what the work of GFIT has been doing that has been open to public consultation. I'm very happy to talk to that. And what you will see for those sectors is absolutely, Sean, there is alignment between the EU and Singapore. Within the debate of that group, we often focus on international operability. We often focus on usability debate. We look at current performance, to Eugene's point, in the domestic economy, and then we look at what are the signals. It's been interesting. Like the most recent debate is on the concept of this traffic light system, and actually maybe that lends itself really well, for example, to debt instruments. Possibly less well to judging a whole company, particularly if that company has multiple different revenue streams and activities that it's conducting. And if you're doing that across 4 environmental objectives, that can be quite a kind of muddy colour that you end up with in terms of understanding what that company's doing. Whereas if you're looking at debt and you're saying, kind of, is that debt, to Eugene's point, at some point kind of moving yourself out of, let's call it a red status, and into the amber status, we want to give you credit. And that's the one thing the EU regime doesn't do. You can move out of red status, but only if you achieve green status do you really get recognition for that product. And then just generally in technical screening criteria, we are certainly aligning to the EU where we can, where it's feasible to, and considering the amber as an approach in local economy.
Transition, specifically, but what about industrial transition? What colour is there in that? What can we learn? The steel sector, the shipping sector, which is so big in Singapore, of course. Where has that gone? Just give it a bit of a flavour. We need to move to wrapping up. I appreciate we could talk for a while about that, but I just want to find out, where are you at on industrials? Eugene, can you hear us?
Sorry, Sean, was that a question? Was that a question for me? Because my mic, my sound's breaking up a little bit.
It's a question for Eugene, the man approaching camera. Where are you at of industrials, shipping,
Sorry,
steel?
Sean. Yeah, you kind of broke up, and I didn't get an audio, so I assumed that wasn't for me. But yeah, I think industrials are an important area, and certainly. Let me talk a bit more about the SMEs. I think that's when you talk about industrials, we need to talk about the SMEs as well, right? So you've got the bigger hard to abate sectors. Certainly we've got to deal with that. And just to also share with everyone, when we started the ASEAN taxonomy journey after releasing version 1, we had massive stakeholder consultations with the real economy players. And it's very clear that for them, we must position that transition carefully, right? Because transition is the balance between ambition and reality. And these two are really, I would say, have a healthy tension. So these two forces have a very healthy tension. If we don't push the ambition far enough, then the reality is always going to be a straggler. And if you don't push the reality enough, then you have an ambition that cannot be achieved. So we're always trying to get that ambition right. So first, hard to abate sectors. I think this is something we really need to get correct. ASEAN is generally an emerging economy bloc. These things are important to help us with our decarbonization journey. But again, we must be very clear that the exits are there. I think that's the first point. The second is with the SMEs, right? Because when you talk about industrials, we also need to talk about the SMEs who form the backbone of the Southeast Asian economy. Now, I think the bigger challenge for us is how do you get the SMEs on board? Because they don't have transition plans, right? And again, coming back to this thing about transition plans, many people think that transition plans are standalones. They are not. They're actually plans that should be integral to a company's strategy and business. And you actually need them for structural transformation. It's not a question of having it just to please a banker, an investor, a customer. Now, I think what is really important is that we build a sustainable finance ecosystem which has the taxonomy, transition pathways, and disclosure, and we move everyone along that ecosystem to ensure that we have structural transformation. I saw Sean looking at this. Shall stop.
That's good. That's good. Look at the watch because we're out of time. Great finish, Eugene. Thank you so much. Yolanda, last thoughts, last reflections for us about where this is going and what we can expect going forward.
Well, if I may, I actually want to answer your last question, which was about industrial decarbonization. I think this is where we expect to see a bit more technical screening criteria, the adoption of a threshold quite useful. So for example, you talk about mining, you can have a nickel mine, you can have a smelter, you can have the captive power plant, and then you look at the carbon intensity per unit of production. And if you have a number that kind of indicates the ballpark of what a low carbon ferronickel is going to look like, that number would be the reference, whether you're above or below, whether you are coal-firing with biomass or you're only using thermal coal, any of the industrial processes in the smelting that can be decarbonized. So I think in some economic activities, the technical screening criteria, the threshold, can come in very handy for evaluation.
And I'm glad you better segue. We've got a critical minerals working group starting at the moment. So we'll be publishing a climate bonds criteria and providing that information to everyone else over the next 6 to 8 months. And in fact, just to give you a sense of the forward agenda here, we're looking obviously at industrials, the steels I mentioned earlier, our cement criteria published today, but also we're looking at resilience. And you've heard a lot today about the importance of addressing resilience, but our understanding of necessary resilience is weak. We are, adapting our water systems without necessarily looking at appropriate adaptation planning. In fact, we're still building water systems in the UK that are not consistent with the changes that are coming through the system. The famous Thames Gateway that was stopped flooding on the Thames was built in 1995. It actually is going to be breached sometime in the next 10 years because they didn't take into account climate change. So we have to build a whole new one. We're doing one further downstream in Thames. This is a global issue. Understanding what the nature of resilient investments are and the level of resilience. And resilience isn't quite the same as adaptation. It doesn't mean building a seawall that can't be breached. It means understanding things will get flooded. We need to rubberize the electronics in the subway so we can just pump the water out the next morning and it'll start working again. That's a resilience approach, if you like. It's necessary, but it's also social resilience. We've learned from the pandemic what we have to do to get our societies back together again when we have a crisis. Economic resilience, shock absorbers and so on. The European Commission's social bond to finance unemployment relief in the middle of the pandemic is an economic shock absorber. We need to institutionalize these things when we have these kind of crises going forward. What does health sector resilience look like? We've learned something in the last couple of years. It means having PPE equipment available. Because if you don't, it's going to be really bad for your health workers, let alone people who are going to be dying as a result of pandemics, etc. Vaccination investments, research. These are necessary investments, not just because they're important, but because climate change brings constant volatility in the physical and also the health environment. Pandemics are a feature of climate change, according to the IPCC. Conflict, mass movements of people, all of these require thinking about how we can address these in advance, including, by the way, food. we've learnt over the last few months with massive food spikes, we've seen the beginning of famines, which have thankfully eased off a little bit thanks to a drop in food prices. But this is a big risk going forward. How do we address this? Some of this will be in being a bit more resilient and growing food locally. Singapore has a target of 30% urban food production by 2030, for example. That's a resilient strategy. There's a lot to be done. The opportunity is, of course, incredible as a result. Rahul and Yolanda will see a lot more green bonds and green finance and sustainable finance as a result, if we can get our taxonomy right, if we can get our guide rails right. So I look forward to that conversation with all of you. Eugene, I guess resilience is not quite there. You focused on taxonomy. Have I said anything out of court? I need to check in with Eugene because he's my ASEAN mentor.
Well, Sean, I think we've been mentoring each other and for the better. So absolutely, I think resilience is something which is naturally built into this. When we talk about the sustainable finance ecosystem, what the taxonomy is just one part of it. It's one of the three pillars. And that ecosystem must be able to create a mutually reinforcing self-contained system between the real economy and the financial system. And that really must be able to bring us on that ultimate destination of resilience that we all need.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Yolanda. And thank you, Nadia, all the way from London for joining us today. Please give them all a clap. Fantastic panel. And fantastic work, more to the point. The last session of the day, in some ways, the most important, because we don't make this transition that we need to make to a clean, green, resilient economy without strong governments, without governments helping us to shift, not alone, but in partnership with capital and the finance sector. This is the secret of change. Joining me in this session, we are lucky to have Shinichi Kihara, who's the Deputy Director General for Environmental Affairs at the Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry in Japan. Japan, as you might know, has adopted robust 2030 emission reduction targets, as well as 2050 targets, and METI has been leading the work in Japan on how to achieve those, working closely with the Kaidenren, with industry and with other ministries, to build on the green bond market that's already got going. We've also got Kenneth Huey, who's the Head of Market Development at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Hong Kong beat Singapore to doing a green bond by a country mile, I'm afraid. They've doing some great work. Singapore's catching up, of course. They're doing some great work on building the green economy in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong as a gateway to China. We will have Lauren Sorkin on stage with me in a minute, Executive Director of Resilient Cities Network, and Michael Paulus, the Managing Director of and Head of Public Sector Group at Citi. Maybe Lauren and Michael, if you're here, come on up. In the meantime, just a couple of things I want to say. We need clarity of targets. You know that. That's what the taxonomy conversation is all about. But we also need to tilt our economies, our societies, and our policy frameworks to being green, to supporting the transition. We've published just today, especially for this, a draft of 101 ideas for government to achieve 1.5. I mentioned it earlier. It's on our website. We'd love you all to look at it and to give us some feedback about it. It includes, the agenda includes risk support, guarantees, blended finance, as was discussed at the MAS conference 2 days ago, de-risking, as well as sovereign green bond issuance, as well as things like green trade windows, and so on and so on. It's a big agenda. Above all, the pipeline of deals have to grow, and that's the collaboration between the public and private sector that's necessary. Today, thank you for joining me, Lauren, Michael, from the stage. Today, I'd like to start the remarks by inviting Shinichi Kihara from METI in Japan, if we can get the screen working, to kick us off with his remarks about what is METI doing? How are you going? Because, of course, we're watching, and I need to let you know that Japan has announced a program of green transformation bond, sovereign bond issuance. amounting to $147 billion equivalent in yen, which is fantastic, going to support liquidity and growth of the market. So METI's work is important in many ways. But please, sir, go ahead.
Yes, hello everybody. Hi, Sean. Good evening from Tokyo. I'm Shinichi Kihara from Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. I'm very happy to participate in this important and timely CBI seminar today. I would like to highlight Japan's focus on trend. How does it work? How it is spreading around internationally. And I believe you have a slide set prepared. May I ask to put on the screen?
Team, can we get the slides up, please? While the technicians are working that out, there seems to be some technical hitch. Perhaps I can just get you to start off on your remarks, and the slides will magically appear. Oh, look at that, just as I said it.
Yes, so starting from this, this is a front page. You can see we have common summit goal of 2050 carbon neutral. Our approach is various pathways to lead to that summit. And some are walking, some are using bikes, and some are flying. So different pathways for different countries and different industries, and using different technologies. That's how we see this whole journey of carbon neutral. Can you turn to the next slide? So why is transition finance beneficial? Achieving carbon neutrality is very important, and at the same time, it is a very challenging task. The challenge is not all countries and industries have the zero emission option today. Some reasons are technology is yet to be developed, or still too expensive in the hard-to-abate industry sectors, or geographically net zero resources like solar and wind is not abundant in some areas. So countries and industries have range of pathways towards the goal of carbon neutral, depending on their own conditions. Such countries or industry that cannot leapfrog today normally faces divestment from banks or investors and find it difficult to make decisions on steady transition. What is strongly needed is a financial mechanism that support their steady efforts of transition, following their dynamic trajectory towards the future net zero commitment and strategies. Japanese government takes lead in establishing a transition finance mechanism. Through the transition finance, we aim to realize both growth and decarbonization by leaving nobody behind in our global challenge towards carbon neutral goal. Next slide. So the government of Japan has implemented three-step policy tools for transition finance. Starting from the left, firstly, METI, together with Financial Service Agency and Ministry of Environment, formulated the basic guidelines on climate transition finance last year. This is in line with the internationally recognized Transition Finance Handbook by the ICMA, International Capital Market Association. Secondly, METI has published the sector-specific roadmaps one by one for 7 hard-to-abate sectors: iron, steels, chemicals, electricity, gas, oil, cement, and paper pulp. Today, we are working on additional roadmap on automobile. And thirdly, to promote the new mechanism, METI has selected model cases using transition finance and have subsidized their certification process. So far, we have selected 12 good cases amounting to $2.5 billion in project procurement. Next slide. Compared to other financing tools, the uniqueness of transition finance is that companies' commitment and strategy to net zero is required. Sector roadmap is a key guiding tool. The roadmap shows existing technologies, shows various technologies, options towards 2050, incorporating both existing technologies and future available technologies with the timing of their practical application. Estimated CO2 emissions associated with the introduction of the technologies are also shown. The roadmap provides credibility to the transition finance mechanism from 3 aspects. First, the roadmap are comprehensive. The 7 sectors covers approximately 70% of total CO2 emission in Japan. The coverage will expand to 80% when we add automobile this year. Secondly, the roadmaps are ambitious, as all sectors aim to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and in line with Paris Agreement. Thirdly, the roadmaps are feasible, as implementation of technologies in the roadmap are backed by national policies and internationally shared materials and IEA's roadmaps and scenarios. The roadmap is intended to be a handy tool for both companies and the financial sector. Companies can refer to the roadmap when they explain the adequacy of the new facility or project that they are going to introduce. On the other hand, financial institutions can use the roadmap as reference to evaluate if companies meet the criteria to be deemed as transition activities. The roadmap is also a living document which will be updated if necessary in accordance with technological development, needs by financial sectors, and geopolitical situations. Next slide. Japan's transition finance roadmaps refer to best available science-based scenarios and assessments. They build on intensive discussion involving experts from banks, asset owners, rating agency, relevant industries, and econometrics modelers and others. Brushed up through such bottom-up process, the roadmap gains credibility from both industry side and financial side. Next slide. Have a quick glance on roadmaps examples in power sector on the left and steel sector on the right. You can see the shape of the trajectories are different as the key technology of hydrogen reduction ion making kicks in the 2040s according to the best available science today. As such, each sector has unique roadmap. Next slide. We recognize that the need for transition finance is becoming stronger internationally. Active discussions on transition finance are taking place in various venues, including the G20, OECD, and private sector initiatives like G-Funds. And just yesterday, the Net Zero Banking Alliance just released the Transition Finance Guide. In the chapter on stock-taking existing frameworks, they refer to the ICMA, International Climate Market Association, and also the CBI, the Climate Bond Initiative. Congratulations, Sean. And then EU taxonomy, and also Japan's Transition Finance Guidelines. Next slide. The International Capital Market Association, ICMA, in their Transition Finance Guideline, points to Japan's sector roadmaps as one of the verification tools to prove appropriate scientific base. Next slide. Asia-Pacific region is the center of gravity of energy today, accounting for 40% of global energy consumption. Reducing greenhouse gas in the region is very important for the international community. While Asia's energy demand continues to grow, it faces challenges such as its high dependence on fossil fuels and the uneven distribution of renewable energy sources. In such situation, the investment will only add socio-economic costs such as job losses and economic burdens. Next slide. So Japan's efforts on transition finance is not closed inside Japan. We support the wider spread of the concept in emerging countries, especially Asian region, where energy demand is expected to grow along with their economic growth. So spearheaded by METI, energy ministers in Asia supported the launch of Asia Transition Finance Study Group, led by over 40 private financial institutions and others last year. This ATF study group aims to provide practical guidelines for transition finance in the region. Next slide. And just last week, in the Asian Green Growth Partnership Ministerial Meeting, participated by energy ministers from ASEAN, Middle East, and others, the Asia Transition Finance Study Group has released the Asia Transition Finance Guideline and Asian Transition Finance Activity Reports. Japan will continue our support for establishing transition finance in the emerging countries, backed by our excellence in this field. Next slide. Sorry, this is the last slide. So in closing, Japan's transition finance mechanism is a complementary framework to provide support to industry making efforts in serious transition, which may not be covered by taxonomy solely. Transition finance is dynamic and credible framework backed by comprehensive, ambitious, and feasible sectoral roadmaps. In addition to transitioning our domestic industries, Japan will support Asian countries to make steady progress towards realistic transitions while maintaining a balance between economic development and people's lives. Thank you very much.
Shinichi, can I say that is incredibly exciting? Well, I mean, that was rich in detail, but the extent to which METI is looking across the industry and developing these programs and now engaging, this has all happened since we've seen the announcements early last year, the 2030 and 2050 guides. I know you've been working very busily, but this is very exciting to see, honestly, and it's thrilling to see. Now, I'd be very interested to engage with you about some of the detail around steel and cement. As you know, we've published our cement criteria today. We've published steel criteria, and I've had this long-running discussion with the Japan Iron and Steel Federation about the extent to which we can shift to green hydrogen DRI rather than have to use gas. But the discussion is there. And that, everyone, is a taste of the change that we're seeing around the world now. With Japan, with the work of METI and others, with the US, with the passing of the Climate Act and the massive subsidies to green hydrogen, to various other activities, with the work in Europe now of Repower EU, fueled by, of course, the war in Ukraine, that's pushing Europe to rapidly scale up renewables. You hear the gas story, you hear the coal story. What you don't hear is the extent to which renewables and energy efficiency are being pushed through as the logical extension of the idea what's under. This global change is underway with big implications for investors and for banks. And I guess for financial regulators too. Kenneth, speaking of which, Hong Kong has been wrestling with this issue about how to shift the economy over, finance sector can take advantage of it for the last few years. Tell us a little bit, a couple of highlights about what you've done and where your thinking is going in terms of this global change that we're seeing, the extraordinary change in China that we've seen, the 30-60 guidelines, or rather targets, I should say, and now US finally coming back on stream and Japan on stream. What's the Hong Kong Monetary Authority perspective?
Well, thank you very much, Sean, and it's great to be here. I'm also very excited to hear about what METI is doing in Japan. The situation in Hong Kong is slightly different because, as you know, Hong Kong is just a city. So the carbon footprint of Hong Kong itself is relatively small. And we also have a very service-heavy economy. So 70% of the carbon emission in Hong Kong come from electricity generation. And 90% of that 70 comes from building. So the approach that we go about reducing carbon is slightly different, quite different, I'll say, from Japan. That's one part of it. And the other part is that Hong Kong has always been the kind of gateway and the hub connecting mainland and the international financial market. And as you rightly point out, China has this very ambitious 30-60 carbon neutrality roadmap, achieving peak carbon by 2030 and then achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. So depending on which estimate you use, the amount of money, the amount of investment needed to achieve that target is talking about 100 trillion RMB upwards. So it's a huge amount of money, and a lot of it would have to come from international capital market, and that's how we kind of in Hong Kong see our role in climate finance, in carbon transition financing in general. As to what we've been doing, I think similar to what many of our counterparts across the world, we're focusing on regulation for sure. So part of it is climate risk management. So to make sure that asset manager, banks, etc., appropriately take into account risk that their asset, their portfolio pose to them from transition, from physical risk, so that they can properly account for it and then shift their investment and lending to more greener purposes. So that's one part of it. And disclosure as well. Previously, we've made commitment to do TCFD disclosure by 2025. And now with ISSB going on in full steam, we're also kind of participating in the process. So that's one part of it, and I believe that regulators across the world are also busy doing. We are also focusing on some of the key hurdles in terms of the ecosystem. So things like capacity building, things like data. I think I see Lauren nodding, and I'm guessing that as NGO in the private sector as well, you're facing the same issues, and we're hoping, and we're actually working with the private sector university to address these. And then finally, there's the awareness aspect. I think in Asia, we're slightly lacking, to put it politely, our European counterpart, for example. And the Green Bond program that Sean, you mentioned at the beginning is one of our efforts to kind of really bring this up people's agenda. Earlier this year, we did a retail green bond, quite heavily oversubscribed by the Hong Kong citizen. I think partly the investment proposition was quite attractive at the time, but also I think people are getting, to know more about this green investment and are hoping to participate in Hong Kong's carbon neutrality plan as well. So that's in a nutshell what we've been doing.
Kenneth, really things have changed in the last 5 years in Hong Kong since you started doing the Green Bond program. We're now, I would say every financial institution I come across in Hong Kong has got a green finance component to their work, whereas literally it was absent prior. So this is the power of sovereign issuance, or sub-sovereign in your case, I have to say, but government issuance in the program, which can really drive changes, hasn't it? Are you seeing that? Am I right in saying that, or as an outsider?
Yes, I certainly think so. I think we're seeing two key changes. One is within banks. Obviously, they participate in our green bond program, some of them as distributors, some of them arranger. So they kind of come to understand a little bit more how this works, and then realize there are opportunities that are out there. But I think there are also the kind of broader ecosystem building effort. We see green external reviewer coming on board, professional service provider coming on board, and that really helped not just the government, but also other corporates and other even SME that are interested in doing green financing to really jump on this bandwagon.
You fired up the ecosystem. That's an incredible achievement, really, and something we can learn about everywhere else. But of course, there's a different kind of issue facing us now, because Shinichi talked about the mitigation agenda in Japan, which is especially critical in an economy that's still relatively high carbon, and there's a lot to be done. But one of the things that Japan teaches us too is around resilience. The last big episode of climate change was in the 1600s, where we saw 2 degrees cooling. And we lost a third of the world's population, according to historians, from war, famine, and pandemic in the 1600s. We had floods, we had years without sun, and therefore famine. As a result, all sorts of things happen. Now, the theory is it's because we killed so many American Indians in the 1500s with measles and smallpox that whole civilizations disappeared in the Amazon, and the forest regrowth, according to research at Stanford, it was so strong that it sucks so much carbon out of the atmosphere, sort of slightly hopeful for sequestration, that it cooled the planet. Now, this is research from one university, I'm going to say contested, but very interesting thought. We certainly had global cooling in that particular period, and there's one region that survived better than any other region. And this was a region where a new government had come into power at the beginning of the region, the Tokugawa regime. And they took a very aggressive stance around ensuring that citizenry was fed, that bridges were rebuilt after every crisis. That wasn't done in places like Europe. In Europe, we saw a descent into war, the 30 Years' War in Germany, with these famines and and led to pandemics afterwards. The Tokugawa regime survived. Japan survived relatively unscathed, with relatively low loss of life by the end of the century, unlike in China, in India, and in Europe. Lessons learned, folks. By the way, one secret lesson, which maybe we should be using in some places, was that when governors of different provinces in Japan did not follow the Tokugawa regime's requirement to open the grain stores and feed the poor when there was a collapse of agriculture, the governors were executed. I mean, okay, I'm not in favor of capital punishment, but I sort of quite like it. Maybe in the US now it could be useful. But look, let's leave that aside. The key point is resilience. Lauren, You're involved in Resilient Cities Network. Tell us about what needs to be done.
Thank you, Sean, for inviting me. I think I'm happy to provide the perspective on resilience and also to save you from having a manel, which I think in this day and age shouldn't be happening. But really glad to also be bringing the resilience perspective. So thank you for asking. I think when we talk about what it is that cities need in terms of building resilience, there are quite a few things. And just for those of you who aren't so familiar with us and wondering, who is this woman and why is she talking about this? I'll just give you a little bit of context. Resilient Cities Network is the oldest and the leading city network working on holistic resilience, so working on responses to climate, to social and economic impacts for cities. And we work with about 100 cities globally, and 21 of those cities are in Asia and the Pacific. So we are experts in terms of helping cities to build capacity, to strategize, and then to try to leverage investment. And something that I always wonder, sitting here, and our headquarters is here in Singapore, is why we're not having an even more urgent conversation than we are. And this is obviously a regional meeting for climate bonds. 98 of the most vulnerable 100 cities to climate change are in this region. 98. And yet, just a tiny, tiny fraction of climate finance, bonds and otherwise, is coming to resilience and adaptation, and an even smaller fraction of that is coming to the subnational level. It's mostly going to the national level. So when we talk about these huge financial flows that are coming into climate, they're actually not coming in to the most vulnerable areas. Because no matter what we do in terms of net zero, and I think this is very clear from the IPCC report, which I now have been reading for 2 decades, like many of you, and they keep getting more and more urgent and more unsettling. No matter what we do in terms of net zero and targets, we are still going to be facing increasing climate impacts over the next decade that we need to prepare for. So when we talk about resilience, Sean, we need to be investing in the kind of infrastructure that keeps us safer. So cities, and I have the pleasure, as I mentioned, of working with about 100 of them, they actually need a much different kind of conversation and a much different kind of engagement when it comes to resilience finance. We see that the goals, even of very ambitious cities like Hong Kong or like Singapore, are setting aside large-scale finance for resilience. But that is happening really at a fraction of the level what we need. We can actually have a much better conversation if we are place-based in our conversations. Right before the pandemic, I'll give you a little anecdote about this. I was sitting in Hong Kong with 4 of the largest real estate investors, with engineers, and with climate scientists. And the conversation was this. We are, as real estate developers, all going through the exercise of downscaling climate models for our new developments by ourselves, because we are not having a holistic conversation about what our risk is to storms and floods. And so we're doing this on our own. Couldn't we, and couldn't Resilient Cities Network help us to have a collective conversation about this and be engaging better together and doing something about the spaces in between? So one of the things that I think is really necessary when we talk about climate finance and mobilizing large capital is actually connecting the dots in a way that is place-based, looking at the place-based risk and opportunities and integrating these large flows of capital, in particular in the built environment, for net zero with upgrading our buildings. And this is not impossible, but it needs to be intentional. So when we're upgrading our building to reduce energy intensity, let's look at what we're doing in terms of absorbing rainwater, preparing for flood, or being resilient to storms. So we need to have these collective conversations, and we need to increase that ambition. I think the other thing that we need to do, and Kenneth mentioned this, and I was nodding, is build the enabling environment. Too often, we're looking at the deal. What was the flow of capital? What was that project? And how did we prepare that project? Rather than how did we prepare the people in the agencies who are going to need to prepare more of those projects? right? There's a really important conversation there, because right now what we risk doing, and I include all of us in this as we prepare individual kinds of interventions into a specific sector or set a specific target that we're going to mobilize X trillions for X purpose, is that we focus on that target rather than focusing on the who is going to have to keep addressing those targets, but rather keep taking those impacts. And so I think that that's where we really need to look at who is the essential community, what is the essential skill base that we need to build. And I think that that's a really exciting conversation in Asia. I've been working here for the last 20 years. And when I first started working here, we had to go to Australia to get the best downscaled climate models. We don't have to do that anymore. We have the Earth Observatory of Singapore. We have the Prime Minister's Office and their climate change capabilities. And that kind of capability is also being grown all around the region. We also have amazing financial interventions that are happening. But connecting those dots in very specific ways needs to happen. And I will end on 2 points in that regard. I think we know where the most at-risk cities are in this region and how important they are to the economic health of our own region. So we need to focus there, really focus on building those capabilities there and leveraging those existing capital flows to build in what we call in resilient cities the R value. Build in the resilience benefits and be really intentional about that kind of holistic design, development, and investment.
Fantastic, Lauren. Thank you. There's a lot to be done, right? And it's about getting the design right up front. I want to turn now to Michael about whether this is happening. Michael, earlier today we were fortunate enough to have Jane Fraser speaking to us from New York, the CEO of Citigroup, who I have to say made a pretty good speech from my perspective about the extent to which cities has committed. And the very first speech Jane Fraser made when she became CEO was around climate change. This is pretty unusual for a global financial institution, I have to say. What does this mean in practice? You're a public sector agencies banker in particular, and this session is about the role of government and so on. I'm curious to hear about the reception. What's actually happening out there? Your mission, as Jane Fraser said, is to help your client transition. Are you getting a ready hearing amongst the various public sector organisations that you're speaking with, mitigation, and from what Lauren says, also resilience?
Thanks very much. The short answer is yes, we are getting response, but let me just make 4 points. First and foremost, energy transition, because that's what we're talking about, is hard. It is very hard, and it's much harder than I ever thought and most of my colleagues thought when we first got involved in this. But it's really critical. I mean, it's unbelievably critical that we do this. I have teenage daughters, and my eldest daughter said to me a couple months ago, he goes, you know, Dad, I'm really proud of you, but hurry up. And it's about the second point I want to make is that it's about to get harder. A lot of people miss this point. I think most of you know California said that by 2035 that they would no longer allow the sale of diesel or gas-powered vehicles. The problem is that nobody ever thought about the fact that if that's the case, in California alone, everything else being equal, the demand for power rises 30%. How in the world are we going to transition at the same time increase that power just for cars, not talking about any other of the increase in demand for anything else? And EV vehicles, I'm not against them, I'm all for them, but this is what I mean by it's getting harder and harder all the time. Because it's not about transitioning just where we are now to something, you know, more green, but it's also how do we grow it at the same time. The third point, and this comes to your point, Sean, is that the governments have to get their head around the fact that they have to play a much, much, much bigger role in the financing. The private sector simply does not have the wherewithal at the present time to do that. And the reason being is that previously, and governments still have this attitude, and I'm not criticizing them, but they haven't gotten their head around this yet. In the past, when governments were involved or multilaterals or whoever else, it was about reducing risk on a project. The returns were there, But from finance, it's like, look, the return is there, but the risk is too high. You get down the risk, I'm fine with the financing. Problem with transition is that they have to reduce the risk, so they have to be involved. That's necessary but not sufficient because the returns are not high enough to attract private capital. So the governments still have not got their head around the fact that it's not just about reducing risk, it's also about putting in enough money in so that they might get a 1% return on their equity part so that the big finance companies, the big investors, the pension funds can get 8 or 9% internal rate of return. They have not gotten their head around it yet because the magnitude that you're talking about here, I know people are throwing around 50 billion, 100 billion of transfers from the developed countries. It's not enough. And it really comes down to trying to figure out how do we get blended finance, not just to reduce the risk, but to get the return attractive enough that the private sector will bail in. And we're not there yet. And it's really hard. I cannot emphasize to you how difficult it is to get something that actually works. And the final point I will just make is that we all need to have a much greater sense of urgency. And I always like to use this quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who was running for president in 1932 during the Great Depression. And he said, he called for bold, persistent experimentation. And that's really what we need to do. Nobody has figured this out. We need to try stuff, knowing that 70 or 80% of it's going to fail. But it's the only way we'll figure out what works and then move on to do the next thing. Because what my fear is in talking about this and being involved in it for 2 years now, the concern that I have is that the great is becoming the enemy of the good. We're trying to get it perfect. We can't figure out how to get it perfect yet or even close. So let's try anything, knowing that most of it's not going to work, but we take what does work and then we try the next one.
So we learn by walking rather than try and get it right up front. Fair enough. But have we seen enough action so far? I mean, you talk about urgency. You're saying it's hard, but at the same time, if we need to be people to just start trying it and doing it, where are we? And I mean, particularly with the resilience, like, I know Singapore's done a good job on water infrastructure, well, especially clean water infrastructure, which is brilliant. Their target on urban food is quite good, but I'm sure there are other things Lauren will tell us about in a minute. But around the region, this is, we've got a hell of a long way to go. Like, have we, in Bangkok, for example, taken measures to avoid a similar kind of flood impact than we had a few years ago when we saw that major outage in the world IT industry as a result? How do we get this going, Michael? How do we get these deals out the door? Because, as you say, time is short. Give us a bit of hope here.
This may be no, I don't mean to be negative, because actually I'm quite positive, but what I'm trying to get the point across is that we just got to try stuff. And what seems to be happening is that, and I've seen this happen in infrastructure as well, public-private partnerships. They take forever. They just take a long time. So if you want to figure out what is going to happen or how it works, sometimes, and I know this is controversial, but sometimes the governments just have to go out and do it themselves and figure out what works. And the one example that seems to be happening, and I'm not directly involved in it, so I don't have the details, but in Poland, where the Poles are basically saying, no, we're buying the coal plants, and no, we're owning them, and we're going to decide when we shut them down and what the ramifications are, rather than waiting for private sector. And I encourage that because we'll find out what works, and we'll find out how much it really costs, and we'll find out whether these other things work. What I find frustrating for me is that we keep running around and around public-private partnerships, and I'm not against those, but they are hard to put together, especially when the returns aren't there. How do you get the private sector in? And it's like, well, if the government says, well, I'm not going to do it unless the private sector's in, it's like, then you're not going to do it. I mean, it comes down to that, and I know that's not very positive sentiment, but I've been working on this stuff for 2 years, as has my team, and you can tell I'm slightly frustrated because it needs to be done, and we're just kind of talking shop after talking shop after talking shop.
Lauren, before I go to Shinichiro in Japan, tell us a little about what you're seeing in the resilience space. Are people acting, public sector bodies actually acting, and what have we got to do?
So in some ways, I would agree that governments are frustrated, and so they are just going and doing it by themselves. If you look at what's happening in New Zealand after the earthquakes, they voted a rate rise in Wellington that looked at upgrading the water infrastructure, increasing the security of building facades at the same time, right? So this is happening, but this is happening in mature markets. So I think there is still a real moral hazard if we don't have a real conversation about decoupling what the private sector can come in and do alone and what the private sector can come in and do with blended finance. I agree that that's a really important point. But I also think the real conversation probably has to happen about the kinds of capital that are important to this discussion. So, you know, we're here at a bonds meeting, right? Bonds and also the pension funds are extremely important players. And I'm actually starting to hear, not enough, I wish it was more, but some of the pension funds say, look, we're actually going to start to think about a different rate of return. Maybe it's not going to be 8, because there's an equity issue here, right? The same funds that have made money before they were actually, you know, taking the fossil fuels out of their portfolios are now taking a little bit more responsibility around the fact that these are the industries that have caused this issue. So we have to have a clear and open conversation about that this is something that we need to do. And I'm seeing some encouraging blended finance models where, and I am a recovering development banker, so just to make that very clear, I used to work at the Asian Development Bank, and so I had a lot of love for the slides and the detailed diagrams coming from Japan because I miss that. There is a lot more happening in terms of bringing in those loans instead of directly financing the governments, especially in middle-income countries, to actually just taking the first risk or take first loss. And that's extremely important. We need to see more of that, and we need to see more of that spread out over the kinds of deals that are going to bring us adaptation or resilience benefits and decarbonization at the same time. We need to actually prioritize, Sean, the kinds of investments that are going to protect people. Because I would bet that if I asked in this room, how many people live in a city? Maybe everyone would raise their hand, right? How many people who live in a city actually think that their city or country is taking enough action to protect them from climate impacts? I would guess that nobody would raise their hand, right? So clearly there's a gap here, and we're seeing finance rush into the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, and that's not where we are. That's not the kind of action that's going to make our kids proud, right? We have to reach higher. We have to jump. So let's do that, and let's talk about the real financial mechanisms that allow us to do that.
Kenneth, I'd like to get you in a minute. I'm going to get you now first, just to alert you, because Lauren raised the comment about property developers in Hong Kong. So I'll be interested to hear where your thinking's been going in the last couple of years about that. But Shinichi, first, if I might say, in Japan, METI, of course, is the organization, well, really frankly, that guided Japan's recovery in the 50s and 60s. The super ministry of METI was incredibly successful at working closely with industry to drive change. I'm interested to know where that discussion is now, and also what is industry saying back to METI about what it's looking for the government to do in this particular crisis we're trying to face to ensure rapid change. What can you tell us about that conversation?
Yes, thank you, Sean. Yes, first of all, before answering your question, thank you for the Japanese history lesson you taught me about the Tokugawa. I didn't really know that. I'm now proud of the Tokugawa period. Yes, your question is about the yes, the role of METI in the 50s and 60s for the recovery, and what is our role in, today in this landscape for the Japanese growth. And right now, after the announcement of carbon neutral 2050 2 years ago, everything has changed, and now this green transformation is the key word. And green transformation means we will do both the growth and also the decarbonization. It's going to happen both together. So this is a business opportunity. the growth opportunity, and this is a solution we will bring to the world. So that's how the perception completely changed. And that's why we are very seriously working on all the financial tool side also. And our observation is, yeah, there's three types of finance. It's for sustainable finance. There's green finance, like renewable, etc. Is finance for already green side. That's for the private sector to support. Then this is innovation finance, which is the government's role to support all the real risky innovation. But then in the middle is this transition finance. We have all these hard to abate sector who we don't want to leave it alone. We want them to transform. So that's why we're working on this transition finance very seriously. But one very serious issue we are working on in this transition finance is the concern on the financed emission. What is happening is the finance sector, the banks, the investors, they have to follow the norm by the G-funds and others and care about the financed emission, how much their clients going to emit. So however, this transition finance, we're talking about hard-to-abate sectors. So the more you invest in this hard-to-abate sector for their serious transition, what happens temporarily is an increase of emission for the financiers. So so these kind of temporary increase to meet the long-term goal of carbon neutral, that has to be allowed, or there has to be some mechanism to disclose this kind of, explain this transition. Why is it temporarily increasing? But there is a commitment towards carbon neutral. So things are getting complicated, but we need to work on really face this hard-to-abate sector. We've already kind of done all the easy part, you know, the low-hanging fruit. But it's now time to really tackle the hard part. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Yes, it's certainly in terms of global portfolios, we have a lot of investors who are now worried about the linear pathway model, who are trying to bring in high carbon companies into their portfolios that will throw out their reporting because they're going to look bad for a year or two, just as Sinisha said. And yet the change in the next 10 years will be tremendous. You know, there's a company called Sasol in South Africa that I think is the world's most carbon intensive company. It's horrible. They make petrol out of coal, for God's sake. It really is bad. But they have a CEO that has got a whole lot of patents on green hydrogen. And he has a business plan which looks interesting. Now, I don't know if it's ambitious enough, but it's the sort of thing we've got to examine and critique, because if he can shift that company into new business lines quickly and keep supplying the customers, they're currently one of the world's largest supplier of hydrogen, produced from gas and so on, shifting to green hydrogen. We want that in our portfolio. But that requires putting in an incredibly high carbon company into a portfolio for the next couple of years, which would be very difficult. This is the challenge of transition, at least in the mitigation space, but maybe not so much resilience, where it's a little more straightforward. Kenneth, over to you. Tell us what your thinking is in the resilience space.
Well, actually, I smile when I heard about Lauren's story about conversation with the real estate developer, because we not so long ago had a similar conversation, but this time with the banks. The reason is that they were looking for data to manage and calculate climate risk, physical risk. And as you could imagine, in Hong Kong, a big part of banks' physical risk is exposure to mortgage loan. And as it turned out, that exercise is still not fully done. I don't know how many years after Lauren had that conversation with the real estate developer. And it's very difficult. We try to get the kind of granular data, granular enough for banks to really do proper risk assessment. Some of the data are at so the metaphorical underground vaults of some government department, which we dig out, but they were not very user friendly. So we're now basically cleaning them up. But there are also data that are residing with insurance company, for example. And those insurance companies are now kind of sitting together, hire a consultant, and group all those data together. And all these work takes a long time and very laborious. So it's more an observation than really a solution for that. I guess we just have to start somewhere, and we're working on it. But I'm not as pessimistic, I would say, as what you know what Michael said just now. I think progress are being made, and often at some less noticed areas. So say, for example, as the name of CBI suggests, a lot of the focus in green finance has been focusing on bond, but in this part of the world, for example, loan has been really big traditionally. And over the past 2-3 years, I can see that green loan really catch up. I think 3-4 years ago, there was hardly any green loan. But I think now with banks making even more commitment to convert their loan portfolio into green and sustainable category, that really catch up. Last year in Hong Kong, loan and bond basically are even in terms of issuance amounts. And this year with the bond market, as we all know, in pretty difficult situation, loan actually far exceed bond in Hong Kong. And I was just looking across the border in the Greater Bay Area in mainland China, just basically one province. And I think at the end of Q1 this year, outstanding green loan was something like 1.6 trillion RMB, whereas green bond outstanding was just 200 billion. I mean, you can argue whether all these green bonds, green loans really meet the kind of standard that some international investors are looking for, but I think that's a little bit beyond the point. The point is really that efforts are being made, and a lot of the efforts actually fell under the radar, and I think we should just kind of work on all of them.
Well, that's a regulator saying that. That's a central bank saying that, folks. Work on all of them. Now, that makes me excited. That gives me a bit of hope. It might even give Lauren a bit of hope. What do you think?
Despite my urgency, I am actually very hopeful about all of this. I think that the conversations are moving more quickly. And I'm actually very encouraged by the regional types of conversations that are happening, because if you look at who provides finance to cities, 90% of it is coming from national actors, not international actors. So, building the capacity of regional and national actors and doing that in collaboration with global actors, but in an appropriate way, is happening. So I'm hopeful on that. I do think that the pace needs to increase dramatically. I think the kinds of conversations we need to be having and the kinds of capacity we need to be building is less general and more specific. And I mentioned that before, but I'll just say it again. I think patient capital has a really important role to play in the climate finance conversation. And I think where we're seeing the biggest flows coming in, is in the impact space, right? And the VC space, where people are rushing in, right? But in terms of philanthropy, less than 4% of philanthropy is on climate. I already mentioned the numbers in terms of financial flows.
Only
on a larger,
4%.
Yes. I know it seems like more, but it's not. So there's a huge need for the kinds of soft finance to join quicker with those proactive actors in the finance space from the private sector to target the most at-risk places. I think the Prime Minister of Barbados said it so eloquently during Climate Week in New York. She said, we're not interested in you guys coming to pay for the undertaker, right? Like, we don't want the insurance payout when everything's gone up, sideways. What we want is preferably the finance now in the places where it's needed most. So I think I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we're having this conversation today at the Singapore Stock Exchange, because I also think that, there's a distinct way that different regions want to manage this. And this is a region that is built on looking carefully, right, at what your risks are and preparing for them in a way that's data-driven and based on your savings and your capabilities. And I think that there is a really, really authentic regional way to build the response here, and it's starting to happen. And I'm very much looking forward to being here in Singapore, being part of those continued conversations, and hopefully staying connected to colleagues on screen as well. Kenneth, we can have a longer conversation about the Hong Kong real estate and banking downscaling and how to manage that. But I am very hopeful that the right kinds of conversations are happening, not just in auditoriums, but also in boardrooms here.
We need to wrap up, everyone. I'm going to ask Michael to summarize, or rather give us a bit of a last reflection in a minute as a banker. But first, I'm just going to ask Sinicha, from Japan's perspective, give us you're in the middle of a very tough process, which is wrestling with what the change is going to. I'm just curious to know a final reflection from you on the sense of energy and hope that you're seeing in Japan, and of course Japan's in the region. What's your view around that? How much energy, how energized do you feel? How energized do you think industry is? How hopeful are you?
Yes, thank you. Yes, we are very optimistic. Japan is always the champion of the technology, and the more we have the time, the more technology comes in. And we're now buying time, doing many things, but eventually we do have a lot of options, including like hydrogen thermal power generation, or ammonia thermal power generation, renewable energy, onshore, offshore wind, etc., carbon neutral solutions. Yeah, so they will come in, and we are very seriously supporting that as well. We have this 2 trillion yen Green Innovation Fund now allocated 90% already, so they're going to come in. So, and technology is always the silver bullet in this discussion. So we're very optimistic, and Japan is ready to support all of this challenge by providing all our technologies to the world. And we look forward to the secure and sustainable energy climate future. Thank you.
You just heard that from one of the most powerful ministries of economy in the world, that's already driven the growth of Japan as a modern economy. Incredibly important words from you, Shinichi. Thank you so much. Kenneth, last word before I go to Michael.
No, I very much share what Lauren and Michael said just now about the need for urgency, and forum like today are useful for raising awareness and pushing things forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Michael.
The point I think I really want to make here is that the longer I've been involved in it, the more sense of urgency I have. So the frustration is not because I don't think things are being done. I want them to go faster. And I think that one of the challenges that we have is that, again, I don't think governments, and I'm not picking on anyone, but just in general, and multilaterals haven't quite got their head around what needs to be done. And I think that once that thinking changes, and blended finance is the way to go, but it's got to be different than the blended finance that we're used to in the past. And then the private sector, once those returns are there and the risks are relatively low, the money will just pour in from a whole variety of places.
Sorry, did you just say the money will just pour in?
Mm-hmm.
You hear that, everyone? I heard that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is if the returns, they don't have to be the highest returns, they have to be reasonable returns. And especially if you're talking about pension funds, infrastructure funds, you don't have to have 20% returns, you have to have low single digits, if you want to think of it as internal rates of return, something like that. Because people, have children, they know this is important, okay? But at the same time, if you're a pension fund and you have a fiduciary responsibility, you can't say, I'm going to put something in with 2% return when inflation is 8. That just ain't going to work. And then you're going to have a bigger problem 30 years from now when people retire. So it's a combination of things. So my frustration that you've heard in my voice is not because I don't think things are happening. It's because I have come to realize that they have to move a lot faster. I mean, a lot faster in order to get to where we need to go.
Fantastic. And of course, this is about risk and risk management, and this is about the risk of getting sustainable returns or losing them. And that's why investors around the world are keen, because they're concerned about matching their assets and liabilities in 20 years' time when you retire. Because if we don't have this problem addressed, they're going to have a great deal of difficulty. That applies to mitigation as well as resilience. Michael, I'm looking forward to working with you last year. As Jane said, sounds like we've got quite a deep partnership coming up, which hopefully means there'll be a lot of capital moving in the right direction. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Shinicha in Tokyo. Thank you, Kenneth in Hong Kong. Thank you, Lauren, for coming in at the last minute you did. And I want you to know 50% of all our panelists were women overall, even though this panel was very besuited with men. My apologies. And Michael, thank you very much. I'm going to invite up to the stage now to finish Harry Cho to do a wrap-up. But please, look forward to a drink food before we leave if we can. Just to wrap up, a last few words, if I may, if you'll indulge me. I'm going to ask Harry to close because, well, she's really good. But also we've got a partnership with the Singapore Stock Exchange. And also we would like the Singapore Stock Exchange to be a lot greener. And I'm about to hear what she's going to say. Of course, it's doing well already. But, you know, I've got to push, right? That's my job. But before I do that, let me just a couple of thoughts on the day. You know what the challenge is. You've heard a lot about that. And in fact, what's been really interesting for me in this trip has been hearing the head of the MAS talk about it in language which is, hey, that's my language. What's going on here? And hearing, in fact, the government, the Deputy Prime Minister mostly talking about this recently. It is a severe challenge, though, and time is very short. Capital is needed in spades. It really is. You know, we have to invest. We can't do this with just government changing a few rules, even though that's necessary. We have to actually build a whole lot of stuff. We're going to have to change the ports of Singapore so they store safely and use ammonia for ships and stop with bunker fuel. It's got to go. And not in 40 years' time. It's got to go much faster than that. Not to mention prepare Singapore for the changed climate they're going to experience. Heat, floods, storms, all those sorts of things. There's a lot to be done. But the capital's there. We have it in spades on our planet. It's one of the things that gives me hope. We are so lucky. Well, it's a weird thing to say in the context of that kind of challenge, but we are so lucky because we have the capital. We've done really well in the last 50 years of creating these pools of patient capital, institutional investment around the world, and it's underemployed. Since 2008, it finally gave up on empty apartments in Las Vegas and has been sitting around in cash management trusts and German bunds, getting a negative interest rate, by the way, and it needs to be put to work. So we do have the capital. We've proven the capital will move. That's why we've got nearly 20% of bonds on the stock exchange here listed as being ESG, thematic, and green already. The money will move if we give them. The problem is the pipeline of deals. So the 3 steps for me. Clarity is important. We have to understand the ambition. If we don't understand the necessary ambition, we make the wrong decisions about what to do. If you don't understand how high the floods are going to be, you're going to build a seawall down here and you'll still get flooded. That would be a waste of time, wouldn't it? And that applies to what we do of mitigation as well as resilience. No room for small, weak measures. And, you know, I regularly in the media call them pathetic because they're not good enough. We have to be tough here. At the same time, we've got to make this understanding easy. This is the role of taxonomies, to drive home a rule set which we can all follow and hopefully your grandmother can understand. That's the test of it here. I don't have a grandmother anymore, so I don't have anyone to test on the family, but so help me out here. That includes transition, that includes resilience. 2, we've got to tilt our economy to being biased towards green. We've had 150 years of being biased towards brown. Incentives still exist all around the world for fossil fuels. It's challenging to get rid of them because of just transition issues, and yet we have to. We have to compensate in different ways, and we make those green. Now, that might be blended finance. It might be de-risking. You know, de-risking can be as simple as banning something. If a government were in Singapore to ban the future sale of petrol-based cars, well, you would immediately de-risk every electric vehicle manufacturer selling here. It'd be like, boom, like that, right? There's no money involved for the Singapore government. It's just simply saying from 2023, there will be no petrol-based cars sold here. Bingo. That's cheap. if you like, fiscally efficient. There's so much we could do. And don't forget sovereign issuance, which is really important to grow appetite, to build liquidity, build benchmark prices and so on. But three, and I want to stress this, we need to develop a pipeline. We need to require imagination. We need to be thinking creatively about what did you do and turn it in to live deals at scale. That's planning. That's invention to a certain degree, and it's shifting our strategies. In that chart I showed at the beginning of the day from McKinsey's, 2/3 of the capital that is required is a shifting of existing capital flows, changing procurement guidelines, changing allocations, building subways instead of freeways. That's a repurposing of capital. But that requires a bit of thinking. That's what we have to do. Oh, well, it's easy, really, Harry, don't you think?
Very, very. Sean, you make it sound so easy, yes.
I just want to say thank you, everyone who's online. We had, I think, nearly 1,000 people watching today around the world, but especially in the region. I want everyone to use the app to talk to each other. The app will stay live. We've got 3 more conferences happening in the next couple of months around the world. Everyone's welcome to join every one of them if you're so interested. And they'll also be available on demand. You'll be able to watch those afterwards, different time zones. But the key thing is connect. Connect with other people who are like-minded. Work out a plot together for change. That's how we do this. It's a movement of people working on a better world. That's the key thing. Thank you for those of you in the hall today for being here in person in Singapore to make sure that we weren't just working on a screen, that we were live, that it was so exciting to be, look, that she's real. She's not a Zoom screen person. That has been a very exciting part for me of today. Thank you so much. And thank you above all to all our speakers who have been fantastic, including the speaker from our prime sponsor today, Citi, Jane Fraser, who kicked off the event today with what I can only call a speech that really surprised me. I hadn't seen it before today. And Citibank's commitment to the area is, you know, like, whoa. I mean, this is Citibank changing. This is a bit like the Empire changing in Star Wars. It's fantastic. It's really fantastic. And of course, Singapore Stock Exchange, our other prime sponsor here that we're so proud to have a relationship with. Harry, over to you to close us out.
Yes, I don't want to stay in between you and the drinks and the connecting just outside. So really briefly, touching upon what Sean said, you might be wondering what FIRST means next to SGX. Firstly, by the way, our branding is Singapore Exchange because we are a multi-asset exchange. But FIRST does not mean we are first. FIRST stands for Future in Reshaping Sustainability Together. So we realize that we as an exchange and we as a platform, we have to promote and foster working together, partnering together, and that's why we're very happy to partner together and provide venues like this where it's really meaningful. And so, you know, I'd also like to thank once again MAS for being here, for HKMA and METI for also being here with us, as well as to Citi as well, of course, and to Jane Fraser for the opening remark. I've also learned a lot. It doesn't matter how long we've been in this field. It's evolving so fast that unless we actually work on it together, I just don't think we can crack it. So sometimes those best ideas come from having those casual drinks. And so thank you so much for being here on behalf of SGX Group. And let's continue the conversations outside. And of course, thank you, Sean, for being here in person with us. Thank you. And to the rest of the CBI team behind the scenes and also our own team who also helped to make this happen. Thank you.
We'll see you outside. And special thanks to the online team. There's a huge online crew around the world. Great job for everyone. Thank you.